My wife grabbed my wallet in the middle of a crowded, expensive restaurant, held up my bank cards, and screamed that she was cutting off my money so I would have to beg. She thought I was just a senile old man living in her basement. What she did not know was that I spent 10 years as a senior fraud risk director for a national bank, and the way I took my revenge is something she will remember for the rest of her life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant person a lesson they will never forget. My name is Lamar. I am 70 years old, and this is the story of how silence became my greatest weapon. The chaotic atmosphere of the anniversary dinner felt suffocating from the moment we sat down. We were seated at a notoriously upscale steakhouse in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by the sharp clinking of crystal glasses and the loud, boastful laughter of wealthy patrons. It was Cameron and Morgan's 5th wedding anniversary. I only attended because my son had practically begged me to come, claiming his wife wanted to make peace and start fresh. That was an absolute lie. Morgan was already on her 3rd cocktail, her voice rising above the ambient noise as she tried desperately to impress an affluent couple seated at the adjacent table. She wore a designer dress that cost more than my first car, flaunting a lavish lifestyle she absolutely could not afford. The exhausted waiter arrived with the exorbitant bill presented on a polished silver tray. I reached into my tailored jacket to pull out a crisp $50 bill for the tip. My hands, slightly stiff from decades of working at a desk, fumbled for just a second. My worn leather wallet slipped from my grasp and hit the marble floor with a soft thud. A few cards spilled out near Morgan's feet. Instead of handing it back to me, her eyes lit up with malicious intent. She slammed her drink down, dove under the table, and snatched my wallet. She began aggressively pulling out every single card, examining them with a greedy, disgusted sneer. Morgan stood up abruptly, causing the harsh scraping of her chair to silence the nearby tables. Waiters paused mid-step, carrying heavy trays of food. She held my cards up high in the air like a hunting trophy for everyone to see. She looked down at me with pure contempt, projecting her voice so the entire dining room could hear her calculated performance. She loudly declared that I was losing my mind, that I was showing severe signs of dementia, and that I could no longer be trusted with my own finances. For my own safety, she announced she was stepping in to take control of my life. I slowly turned my gaze to Cameron. My son. The boy I had raised entirely on my own after his mother passed away. The man whose college tuition I paid by working 80-hour weeks without complaining. Cameron stared intently at his half-eaten steak. He did not say a single word to defend me. He just nervously adjusted his expensive tie and allowed his wife to degrade his father in public. Emboldened by his cowardly silence, Morgan leaned in close across the table. Her voice echoed sharply over the stunned restaurant. She sneered that she had a newly drafted power of attorney and that my days of wasting money were over. Then she screamed the words that sealed her fate. "I have blocked all your cards, now you will only be begging." Strangers stared at us with deep pity. The manager took a hesitant step forward, unsure how to handle the domestic abuse unfolding in his fine dining establishment. Any other man my age might have cried out in deep shame. Any other father might have shouted back, demanded his property, or pleaded desperately with his son to intervene and stop the madness. I did none of those things. I sat perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply looked at the specific plastic cards clutched tightly in her manicured fingers. I let the absolute suffocating silence stretch between us. My silence was not submission or defeat. It was a calculated assessment. I knew exactly who she was dealing with, even if her staggering arrogance had blinded her to the truth. She genuinely thought she was holding standard debit cards linked to a meager fixed income pension. She was arrogant enough to assume that a quiet older black man wearing a simple suit had nothing to hide and absolutely no power to fight back against her cruelty. She was disastrously wrong. Among the plastic she squeezed so tightly were 2 solid black cards with no identifying commercial bank logo, featuring only a secure microchip and a sequence of embossed silver numbers. I am not a helpless retiree waiting to die in a dark basement. For a decade, I worked as a senior fraud risk director for a major national banking institution. I spent the absolute peak of my career hunting down complex wire fraud, dismantling global money laundering syndicates, and prosecuting high-level corporate embezzlement. I know federal banking regulations better than the wealthy lawyers who write them. Those black cards she seized were not personal checking accounts for groceries and gas. They were Tier 1 corporate expense cards tied to an inactive, federally monitored limited liability company I still managed for a government veteran housing grant. By placing those cards into her expensive designer purse, Morgan had not just committed a simple act of elder abuse. The very moment she decided to swipe them to fund her lavish lifestyle, she would be committing corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud. I did not need to fight her for my wallet or cause a scene. She was meticulously building her own federal prison cell, and I was perfectly willing to hand her the keys. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, wiped my mouth with deliberate slowness, and placed it neatly on the table. I looked at Cameron one final time, searching his avoiding eyes for a shred of the honorable boy I had raised. He refused to meet my gaze, shrinking further into his leather chair like a frightened child. That cowardly avoidance was all the confirmation I needed to move forward with my plan. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the restaurant without uttering a single syllable to either of them. Behind me, Morgan scoffed loudly, telling the uncomfortable waiters not to mind the confused old man wandering off to the bus stop. I usually took the city bus back to the damp, cramped basement room in their house, the same house I had quietly allowed them to live in rent-free, but tonight was entirely different. I walked right past the illuminated bus shelter where a few people were waiting. I stepped to the curb, raised my hand, and a sleek, luxury black town car pulled up instantly. The driver, wearing a sharp black suit, stepped out and opened the heavy door, addressing me respectfully by my former executive title. I slid into the plush leather-back seat, leaving the restaurant, my ungrateful son, and my miserable old life behind in the rearview mirror. I pulled out my phone and dialed the direct number of an old friend who ran the federal audit department. I told him we had a live one. The game had just begun. The black town car glided smoothly to a halt in front of the grand entrance of the St. Regis Hotel. A uniformed valet immediately opened my door, offering a stark contrast to the damp, cramped basement room I had occupied for the last 2 years. I stepped into the sprawling, marble-floored lobby, breathing in the scent of fresh lilies and polished wood. I approached the concierge to secure a luxury suite for the week, handing over a secondary card I kept securely in my inner jacket pocket. As the clerk handed me my room key, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly against my chest. I pulled it from my pocket. The screen lit up with a barrage of text messages from Morgan. The first message read that she had already locked my personal checking account and transferred my meager pension to a joint account she controlled. The second message aggressively ordered me to take the city bus back to the basement and wait patiently for my weekly cash allowance. The final text was a photograph of my leather wallet sitting on her expensive kitchen counter, accompanied by a mocking, laughing emoji and a threat that if I fought back, she would call the authorities to declare me legally incompetent. I did not type a response. I simply swiped the notifications away, silenced the device entirely, and walked toward the hotel lounge. The lounge was dimly lit, smelling of aged oak, expensive cigars, and quiet money. I spotted him immediately in a secluded corner booth. Alistair Pierce sat with a glass of neat scotch resting on the table before him. Alistair was a sharp, silver-haired federal banking auditor with piercing blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. We had fought in the financial trenches together for years, navigating the murky waters of financial compliance, and he was the only man I trusted with this highly sensitive operation. I slid into the leather booth across from him. He took a slow sip of his drink and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. He asked if the anniversary dinner went exactly as I had predicted. I nodded, placing my phone flat on the table. I told him my daughter-in-law had taken the bait, humiliated me in public to establish her dominance, and currently had the corporate expense cards sitting in her designer purse. Alistair let out a low, humorless chuckle. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished mahogany table. He stated that the level of sheer arrogance required to steal unidentified black cards from a former risk director was truly staggering. We immediately shifted into a clinical breakdown of the impending situation. Alistair detailed the exact legal boundaries Morgan was about to obliterate. If she only used my personal debit card, it would be a localized civil issue. It would be a messy family dispute over elder abuse that municipal police rarely took seriously and almost never prosecuted with any real vigor. But the moment she swiped those specific black corporate cards, the jurisdiction shifted instantly. Alistair tapped the rim of his crystal glass to emphasize his point. He explained that any transaction made with those specific corporate cards utilized a secured interstate banking network. The absolute second she authorized a payment for her personal gain, she would trigger Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343, wire fraud. Furthermore, because the funds were tied directly to a registered corporate entity, she would simultaneously be committing corporate embezzlement. The local police would have absolutely no jurisdiction over the matter. The investigation would immediately and automatically fall into the hands of federal agents. I asked him about Cameron. Alistair pulled up a heavily encrypted digital file on his tablet. He confirmed that since Cameron's name was listed as a secondary authorized user on the personal checking account Morgan was using to funnel money, my son was now legally positioned as an accessory to federal crimes. The cold reality of it settled over me. Cameron had made his definitive choice at the restaurant when he stared at his steak and allowed her to strip me of my dignity. Now he would have to face the devastating federal consequences of his own cowardice. Alistair and I had spent an entire decade working side by side in a windowless command center in Washington. Our daily routine consisted of tearing apart sophisticated shell companies tracking offshore money laundering cartels and building ironclad prosecution files against billionaire fraudsters. We knew exactly how criminals thought, how they panicked when cornered, and exactly how they slipped up when they believed they were untouchable. Morgan was a greedy amateur playing a deadly game designed for apex predators. I stared at the ice melting in Alistair's glass, thinking about the true nature of the black cards she had stolen from me. Those cards belonged to an inactive limited liability company that I still managed. The LLC had been established specifically to distribute federal grants for veteran housing initiatives across the state. The accounts were federally monitored and fully funded, holding significant financial reserves waiting to be allocated to struggling veterans. The money she now possessed did not belong to a helpless old man. The funds belonged directly to the United States Treasury. By attempting to exploit me, Morgan had unwittingly bypassed simple family theft and crossed directly into stealing from the federal government. The penalties for misappropriating government grant funds were severe, carrying mandatory minimum sentences that no high-priced defense attorney could negotiate away. I had spent years guarding those funds from sophisticated corporate thieves who used complex algorithms to breach our systems. Now an entitled, manipulative woman with a penchant for designer dresses was about to trigger a system designed to crush international syndicates. She viewed me as an easy target, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently holding a live federal grenade in her expensive handbag. Alistair slid his secure tablet across the table so I could view the interface. The banking dashboard displayed the current status of the black cards Morgan possessed. He pointed to the automated security protocols listed on the screen. Under normal circumstances, the banking algorithm would instantly flag any sudden high-value transaction that deviated from my established spending pattern. If Morgan attempted to buy a luxury item or book a first-class flight, the system would immediately freeze the card, send a fraud alert to my phone, and block the purchase entirely. That automated protection would stop her before she could do any real damage to the account or to herself. I looked Alistair dead in the eye and instructed him to lift the automated flags. I told him to remove every single spending limit, disable the geographic location blocks, and turn off the suspicious activity notifications. Alistair smiled a predatory, knowing smile. He understood exactly what I was doing. We needed her to feel invincible. We needed her to believe she had completely conquered the system and gotten away with the perfect crime. By removing the safety nets, we were giving her enough rope to hang herself. Alistair's fingers danced across the tablet, inputting his top-tier administrative credentials. With a few decisive taps, he bypassed the bank's standard defense mechanisms. The screen blinked green, confirming the security overrides were active. The cards were now a silent, unrestricted federal tripwire. Every swipe she made would be quietly logged, categorized, and built into an inescapable federal indictment. I leaned back against the plush leather booths, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The trap was fully armed, the bait was taken, and all I had to do now was wait for her to start spending. The morning sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when the first notification silently flashed across Alistair's secured tablet. Morgan wasted absolutely no time. Drunk on the delusion of absolute power, she began her reckless spending spree before normal business hours even commenced. She started her morning at a high-end online boutique, dropping $4,000 on designer handbags and shoes. She clearly believed she had conquered me entirely, treating my life savings as her personal lottery winnings. Within an hour, the geographical location of the transactions shifted to a luxury travel agency. She boldly booked 2 first-class, non-refundable tickets to a 5-star resort in the Maldives. She was desperately purchasing the lavish lifestyle she constantly projected on social media, but could never actually afford on Cameron middle management salary. Every single swipe of that black corporate card was a brazen declaration of her staggering arrogance. She was so convinced of her own superiority that she did not even attempt to mask the shipping address or hide her digital tracks. The expensive designer goods were being sent directly to my house, the exact same house she believed she was going to evict me from. She felt completely untouchable. Alistair and I sat at the heavy glass dining table in my hotel suite, drinking dark roast coffee while watching the digital ledger light up. It was a clinical, highly synchronized operation. We were not angry victims helplessly watching a common thief steal our livelihood. We were veteran federal risk directors patiently observing a high-value target move directly into a meticulously prepared kill zone. Alistair typed rapidly on his keyboard, tracking the merchant identification codes and IP addresses in real time. He categorized the luxury purchases into a neat, organized folder, compiling undeniable evidence for the impending federal indictment. Everything was proceeding exactly according to our statistical models for arrogant amateur embezzlement. Then the rapid rhythm of the transactions abruptly changed. A massive, unexpected charge appeared on the banking dashboard, flashing in bright red text. It was not for designer shoes or an exotic vacation or expensive jewelry. It was a single flat wire transfer for $65,000. Alistair frowned and tapped the screen twice to isolate the specific routing number. Embezzlers rarely move such large round numbers in a single transaction unless they are backed into a corner and extremely desperate. I leaned over the polished table to examine the merchant destination code. The heavy funds were not routed to a luxury brand or an offshore account. They were funneled directly into a commercial banking account belonging to an obscure regional vendor named Apex Structural Solutions. I instructed Alistair to pull the corporate registration records for the vendor immediately. In my 10 years of dismantling wire fraud syndicates, I had learned that financial anomalies like this always revealed the true unvarnished motive behind the crime. Stolen money leaves a permanent digital footprint, and it always flows toward a source of deep desperation. Alistair ran the company name through the Federal Business Registry database, bypassing the public firewalls. The detailed results populated on the glowing screen within seconds. Apex Structural Solutions was not a legitimate operating commercial construction firm. It was a failing contractor business buckling under massive insurmountable debt and multiple unresolved civil lawsuits. The company was hemorrhaging money and actively facing imminent bankruptcy. I scanned the executive officer details listed on the corporate charter document. The primary shareholder and chief executive officer was a man named Richard Sterling. The name immediately clicked into place in my memory. I sat back in my plush leather chair and let out a sharp, humorless breath. Richard Sterling was Morgan's father. The missing pieces of the puzzle aligned with devastating absolute clarity. Morgan was not just stealing to fund her superficial wardrobe. She was actively bailing out her own bankrupt family using stolen federal government funds. I watched the transaction settle in the ledger. She had leveraged my son cowardice to gain access to a financial lifeline for her own sinking ship. She was transferring massive amounts of illegal capital under the completely misguided belief that an old man would never notice the missing funds. The sheer hypocrisy of her actions was genuinely staggering. Just 24 hours ago, Morgan had stood in a crowded upscale restaurant and publicly humiliated me. She had screamed that I would be begging on the streets for spare change. She projected the polished image of a wealthy, successful woman burdened by a senile, impoverished father-in-law. But the unvarnished financial truth was sitting right in front of me on a glowing screen. Her entire identity was a meticulously constructed, fragile facade. Her family possessed no real wealth or status. Her father was a failed contractor drowning in debt, and she was absolutely desperate to keep up appearances among her wealthy social circle. She had seized my cards not just out of pure cruelty, but out of profound financial panic. She was utilizing the grant funds I managed for struggling veterans to salvage her father's sinking business. By funneling that massive sum of money directly into Apex Structural Solutions, she permanently tied her father company to the embezzlement scheme. She had just contaminated his commercial bank accounts with stolen United States Treasury funds. When the federal authorities eventually seized those assets, her father's entire business would be liquidated by the government to pay the restitution. She thought she was executing a brilliant covert financial rescue to save her family legacy. In reality, she had just signed her father's financial death warrant. Her arrogance blinded her to the consequences of moving institutional money across state lines. She assumed she was stealing from an unprotected pensioner. She failed to realize that her selfish bailout had transformed her father from a struggling local businessman into a co-conspirator in a major federal crime. The $65,000 wire transfer was large enough to guarantee mandatory federal prison time, but I needed the trap to be completely inescapable. I needed a pristine audio recording of her voice explicitly authorizing the theft. I signaled Alistair to deploy the final operational hook. Alistair contacted his secure compliance team in Washington and ordered them to initiate a manual fraud verification call. The strict protocol required a bank representative to call the primary phone number tied to the user profile. Morgan had arrogantly updated the contact information to her own cell phone early that morning. Alistair routed the live audio feed directly to the speakers in my hotel suite. We listened in absolute silence as the phone rang twice. Morgan answered with a brisk, irritated tone, annoyed by the interruption. The federal agent introduced himself as a corporate compliance officer requesting verbal authorization for the heavy wire transfer to Apex Structural Solutions. He calmly informed her that to release the funds she needed to verify her identity as the primary account holder. Morgan did not hesitate or stumble. Without a single ounce of remorse, she confidently stated her name was Lorraine. Lorraine was my late wife. Morgan coldly impersonated the woman I had loved and mourned for over a decade just to steal government money. Alistair recorded the entire unedited audio file, saving it directly to a secure federal server. The verification completed and the compliance officer released the funds. Morgan hung up the phone, believing she had just outsmarted a major national bank. She had no idea she had just committed a Class A federal felony on a recorded line. The wire fraud was now absolute. The trap had snapped entirely shut. The heavy glass doors of the luxury lounge swung open violently. Morgan marched across the polished marble floor with aggressive stomping strides. She ignored the discreet protests of the hotel concierge and locked her furious gaze directly on me. She had clearly tracked the initial luxury car service charge through the banking application before Alistair and I locked her out of the notification dashboard. She wore a sharp designer blazer and clutched her expensive handbag, radiating a toxic mixture of panic and rage. She expected me to be huddled in a cheap diner or wandering the streets in despair. She expected her phone to be flooded with my desperate apologies and humiliating pleas for cash. Instead, I was sitting comfortably in a private velvet booth, drinking imported coffee and completely ignoring her existence. That profound silence infuriated her more than any shouting match ever could. She stormed over to my table, her face flushed red with indignation, and slammed both her hands down on the polished wood. She demanded to know who I thought I was hiding in a five-star hotel while she was busy managing my pathetic life. Morgan did not care about the sophisticated atmosphere of the luxury lounge or the alarmed stares of the wealthy patrons seated nearby. She thrived on creating public spectacles to intimidate her victims into compliance. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a heavily creased official-looking document, and slammed it forcefully onto the table next to my coffee cup. She leaned over me, her voice cutting through the quiet jazz music playing overhead. She loudly announced that she was officially terminating my residency at the house. She stated the document was a formal 30-day eviction notice, and that if I did not comply immediately, she would have the local sheriff drag me out of the basement by force. She was incredibly confident in her aggressive performance, believing her sheer volume would completely break my spirit. She then issued her ultimate ultimatum. She told me I had exactly one option to avoid dying homeless on the streets. She pulled a second document from her bag and slapped it down next to the first. It was a drafted legal contract directing the total sum of my monthly retirement pension to be deposited directly into her personal checking account. She sneered that my financial independence was a proven danger to myself and that she would generously allow me to keep living in the basement if I surrendered every single cent of my future income to her and Cameron. She crossed her arms, tapped her expensive high heel against the floor, and waited for my absolute surrender. I did not look at the papers. I did not flinch or react to her shouting. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, maintaining eye contact with her the entire time. I set the cup down precisely on its saucer. I informed her in a low, perfectly controlled tone that she was currently holding a worthless piece of paper. I told her that a person cannot legally evict a man from a property he rightfully owns. I pushed the fake eviction notice back across the table with a single finger. I stated firmly that I would not sign away a single dime of my pension. I would not be returning to the basement, and she needed to leave the hotel before I had security remove her for harassment. Morgan scoffed loudly, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, arrogant amusement. She mocked my confidence loudly, declaring to the observing patrons that my dementia was clearly worsening. She leaned closer, her expensive floral perfume masking the stale scent of her desperation. She whispered harshly that I was a delusional old fool who had completely lost his grip on reality. She insisted she and Cameron were the sole legal owners of the property, and that I was nothing more than an unwanted, ungrateful guest who had overstayed his welcome. Her absolute certainty regarding the ownership of the property was built on a foundation of profound ignorance. Morgan married my son 5 years ago and simply assumed the sprawling 4-bedroom colonial house they lived in belonged entirely to him. Cameron, eager to project the image of a highly successful architect to his ambitious new wife, never corrected her assumption. He let her believe he had purchased the property with his own lucrative income. The factual reality was entirely different. I bought that house over 30 years ago. 10 years ago, right after my wife Lorraine passed away, I utilized a substantial portion of my executive bonuses to pay off the entire mortgage balance in a single lump sum. I hold the absolute unencumbered deed to the property. When Cameron graduated from college with mounting student debt, I allowed him to move into the master suite. When he married Morgan, I quietly moved my belongings down to the finished basement to grant them privacy and space to build their marriage. I paid the annual property taxes. I paid the homeowner insurance. I covered the costs for every major repair from the new roof to the upgraded plumbing system. Cameron never contributed a single dime toward the equity of that house. He simply enjoyed the profound privilege of living rent-free while projecting a false image of immense wealth to a woman who only valued him for his perceived financial status. Morgan was attempting to threaten me with an eviction from a home I owned outright, operating under a delusion my cowardly son had carefully maintained for years. She had confidently marched into this luxury hotel to threaten me with homelessness, completely unaware that she was standing on my property every single day of her life. Her entire leverage was based on a lie Cameron constructed to keep her satisfied. I watched Morgan smirk, utterly convinced of her dominant position. I calmly informed her that she needed to verify her facts before staging a public meltdown because my name was the only name listed on the county property deed. Her arrogant smile did not waver. Instead, it broadened into a dark, triumphant grin. She leaned forward, placing both her hands flat on the table, and delivered her crushing blow. She whispered that my name might have been on the deed yesterday, but it was not there today. She revealed that she had convinced Cameron to execute a quitclaim deed. She boasted that my son had officially signed my rights away, transferring the entire legal ownership of the property directly into a joint trust controlled exclusively by her. The cold reality of her words struck me like a physical blow. A quitclaim deed requires the notarized signature of the property owner to be legally binding. If Cameron submitted that document to the county clerk, he had not merely allowed his wife to disrespect me at a restaurant. He had actively and willingly forged my signature to steal my home. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had sacrificed everything to protect, had conspired to leave me entirely destitute. Cameron was no longer a passive bystander bullied by a manipulative spouse. He was a fully complicit criminal participating directly in my destruction. Morgan snatched her fake eviction notice off the table, gave me a sickeningly sweet smile, and told me to enjoy my last few days of hotel luxury before the money ran out. She spun around and marched confidently out of the lounge. I sat in the quiet booth, the bitter taste of absolute betrayal settling in my chest. The financial trap was no longer just for her. I reached for my phone, ready to summon the son who had just signed his own federal death warrant. I sent a single text message to Cameron indicating an address and a time. It was an old 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city, a place we used to visit every Sunday morning when he was just a boy playing Little League baseball. The air inside smelled faintly of burnt coffee and frying grease. The faded red vinyl booths offered a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the hotel lounge I had just left. I sat in a back corner booth, nursing a mug of black coffee and waiting. The bell above the glass door chimed sharply. Cameron walked in. He wore a tailored suit that fit a little too tight around the shoulders, projecting the false image of success he so desperately clung to. He scanned the quiet room, spotted me in the corner, and marched over with rigid, stiff steps. The physical tension radiating off him was palpable. He slid into the booth across from me, avoiding direct eye contact just as he had done at the steakhouse. He checked his expensive watch, letting out an exaggerated sigh of deep inconvenience. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply demanded to know why I had dragged him to such a rundown establishment in the middle of his busy workday. I looked at the tailored suit he wore and the nervous sweat beading on his forehead. I placed my hands flat on the scratched Formica table. I told him in a low, steady voice that I knew exactly what Morgan was doing with the bank cards she stole from me at the restaurant. I detailed the designer purchases and the international flights she had boldly booked using corporate funds. I offered him one final, absolute chance to intervene and stop this madness. I told him to call his wife, demand she drop the cards on the table, and walk away before she crossed a legal boundary that neither of them could ever return from. I gave him the perfect opportunity to confess to the forged quitclaim deed, to show a single ounce of remorse for attempting to steal the house I had paid for with decades of my own blood and sweat. Instead of apologizing or showing fear, Cameron scoffed loudly. His face twisted into a mask of ugly, aggressive resentment. He leaned across the table, slamming his hand down flat against the plastic surface. He stated that Morgan was doing exactly what needed to be done because I had become an unbearable financial and emotional burden to their marriage. He raised his voice, ignoring the waitress who was wiping a nearby counter. He aggressively defended his wife, claiming she was just trying to secure their rightful financial future against my stubborn refusal to surrender my assets gracefully. I asked him directly if securing his future included forging his own father's signature on legal county real estate documents to steal a house he never paid a dime for. Cameron did not even have the decency to look ashamed or lower his gaze. His eyes narrowed with bitter, toxic entitlement. He coldly replied that I owed him that house for forcing him to grow up without a mother and for prioritizing my banking career over his childhood. He justified the felony forgery by claiming I was eventually going to die anyway, and he was merely expediting the administrative inheritance process to avoid probate taxes. He demanded I stop throwing childish tantrums, accept my new position as a dependent, and immediately surrender all my remaining bank passwords to Morgan so she could manage my care. He warned me that if I continued to fight them, they would proceed with the medical evaluations to forcefully place me in a state-run nursing facility. He sat back in the booth, crossing his arms over his chest, utterly convinced that his threats had successfully cornered me. He firmly believed that his father was a broken, defeated old man who would simply bow his head and accept the utter destruction of his dignity. I stared at the man sitting across from me and felt a profound, chilling emptiness settle in the center of my chest. I spent 38 years loving him, protecting him, and trying to build a foundation so he would never have to struggle the way I did. I remembered the countless nights I stayed awake helping him study for his architectural exams, and the grueling overtime shifts I worked to ensure he graduated completely debt-free. I had built my entire existence around providing for my son. But looking into his cold, entitled eyes, I realized the devastating truth. The boy I raised with so much love and sacrifice was entirely gone. Perhaps he had died years ago, or perhaps he had never truly existed at all. He had been replaced by a selfish, greedy parasite who viewed my continued breathing as a massive inconvenience to his lifestyle. I felt a brief, sharp wave of grief wash over me, mourning the absolute loss of my family. I grieved for the son I thought I had, but that grief quickly hardened into a cold, impenetrable armor of resolve. I accepted reality in that cramped diner booth. Cameron was not a victim of a manipulative spouse. He was a willing, eager participant in my financial execution. He had traded his honor for the illusion of wealth, and he was completely willing to step over my dead body to maintain that illusion. The paternal instinct that had shielded him from the harsh realities of the world evaporated completely, leaving behind only the clinical, calculating mindset of a federal risk director preparing to neutralize a threat. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I placed it deliberately on the table to cover the cost of the coffee neither of us had bothered to drink. I stood up from the faded vinyl booth, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. I looked down at Cameron, whose arrogant smirk was beginning to falter under my icy silence. I told him with absolute, unshakable certainty that he was no longer my son. I stated that the boy I raised would have been a man of honor, and the creature sitting in front of me was nothing more than a thief waiting for a handout. I informed him that I would not be surrendering any passwords, I would not be returning to the basement, and I would absolutely not be attending any medical evaluations. I turned my back on him and walked toward the exit of the diner, ignoring his sudden, confused shouting behind me. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, pulling my phone from my pocket. I opened my encrypted messaging application and typed a single predetermined code phrase to Alistair Pierce. It was the absolute confirmation we had agreed upon. The message instructed Alistair to officially initiate the federal audit and lock the commercial transaction trap we had set. As I walked down the busy street away from the diner and away from my past, I knew the financial devastation was now entirely out of my hands. The federal machinery was officially in motion, and the countdown to their absolute destruction had just begun. Morgan sat elegantly cross-legged on a plush white leather sofa inside the VIP showroom of the city's most exclusive European auto dealership. She was sipping sparkling water from a crystal flute, acting as though she had been born into generational wealth instead of marrying into a heavily indebted middle-class family. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the afternoon sun gleamed off the polished hood of a brand-new $90,000 sports car. It was a viciously expensive machine painted a custom matte black and designed entirely to scream financial superiority. For Morgan, this car was the ultimate status symbol, an aggressive weapon to parade in front of her country club friends and wealthy neighbors. She had spent the last 2 hours demanding ridiculous modifications, rejecting multiple interior color swatches, and belittling the dedicated sales staff at every opportunity. When the time finally came to execute the transaction, she did not hesitate for a single second. She opened her designer purse and pulled out the solid black corporate card she had stolen from my wallet. She handed it to the eager finance manager with a condescending flick of her wrist, entirely confident that my supposed life savings were about to seamlessly fund her ultimate vanity project. 10 minutes later, the finance manager returned to the VIP lounge. The eager customer service smile had completely vanished from his face, replaced by a nervous, pale sweat. He held the black card delicately by the edges as if it were a dangerous, explosive device. He cleared his throat and politely informed Morgan that the transaction could not be completed under any circumstances. The banking system had immediately flagged the $90,000 swipe as unauthorized and placed a hard block on the terminal. The dealership required an alternative form of payment or a direct wire transfer from a verified account to release the vehicle today. Morgan did not calmly ask for an explanation or offer to call her bank to sort out a simple security measure. Her reaction was immediate and violently explosive. She slammed her crystal flute down onto the glass coffee table so hard the water spilled over the polished edges. She stood up abruptly, towering over the nervous finance manager, and began screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know if he had any idea who she was and exactly how much money her family possessed. She aggressively accused the manager of running the card incorrectly, claiming his outdated dealership equipment was entirely to blame for the massive public embarrassment. The manager politely tried to explain the strict banking protocols for high-value luxury purchases, but Morgan refused to let him speak a single word. Her shrill voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the showroom, drawing the shocked stares of other wealthy customers and sales associates. She unleashed a torrent of absolute entitlement, threatening to have the manager fired and promising to destroy the dealership reputation on social media if she did not drive out of the lot in that exact car today. She snatched the black card out of his trembling hand and aggressively ordered him to march back to his office and run the transaction again immediately. She insisted it was a simple automated fraud alert that she could easily bypass because she had absolute legal authority over the account. She paced back and forth across the showroom floor, fuming with toxic indignation. She loudly complained to anyone listening that the incompetence of the working class was genuinely staggering. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her public tantrum was simply drawing more eyewitnesses to her massive federal crime. The finance manager, terrified of the escalating public relations disaster and desperate to salvage a massive commission, retreated to his glass-walled office to attempt the transaction one more time. Morgan stood by the window, glaring at the sports car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She genuinely believed her aggressive display of dominance would bully reality into bending to her will. She tapped her expensive heels against the showroom tiles, demanding a fresh espresso from a passing receptionist who quickly scrambled away to fulfill the order. Morgan reveled in the fear she instilled in the dealership's staff. She viewed their compliance as validation of her superiority. She checked her reflection in a nearby mirror, fixing her hair and preparing her triumphant speech for when the manager inevitably returned with apologies. She had spent her entire adult life using aggression to mask her financial insecurities, and right now she felt entirely invincible. While Morgan was terrorizing the dealership staff, Alistair Pierce and I were actively monitoring the entire situation from my hotel suite. The moment the finance manager attempted the first $90,000 swipe, our secure federal dashboard lit up with flashing red alerts. The automated banking algorithm had functioned exactly as designed, instantly blocking a massive out-of-state luxury vehicle purchase on a corporate grant account. It was a standard defense mechanism against unauthorized capital flight. I stared at the flashing terminal and gave Alistair the final directive. I told him to manually override the block and force the authorization completely through the system. Alistair nodded, his fingers moving rapidly across the encrypted keyboard. He explained the exact tactical necessity of this specific maneuver. If we allowed the system block to remain, Morgan would simply walk away empty-handed, facing only minor local charges for attempted misuse of a financial instrument. However, we needed her to successfully complete the transaction. In the realm of federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, crossing the $10,000 threshold is a critical legal milestone. An illicit transaction of $90,000 instantly elevates the crime to a Class A federal felony. By letting the dealership payment process successfully, we were transforming a localized family theft into an aggravated high-tier federal offense involving the explicit misappropriation of government-allocated funds. We needed the financial damage to be catastrophic and irreversible to guarantee a mandatory minimum prison sentence without any possibility of a plea deal. Alistair hit the final execution key, sending a direct manual approval code straight to the dealership terminal. The trap was now perfectly set. Back in the dealership, the finance manager stared at his computer screen in absolute shock. The bright red error message suddenly vanished, replaced by a glowing green approval code. The massive $90,000 transaction had miraculously cleared the banking network. He let out a heavy sigh of relief, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and quickly printed out the final vehicle registration documents. He walked back out to the showroom floor, plastering a highly apologetic and submissive smile onto his face. He approached Morgan, handing her the black corporate card along with a thick stack of legal paperwork. He apologized profusely for the technical inconvenience, attributing the entire delay to an overly sensitive bank server. Morgan snatched the card back with a smug, victorious smirk, completely validated in her terrible behavior. She believed her aggressive shouting had successfully intimidated the bank into releasing my money. She sat down at the glass table, picked up a heavy silver pen, and began signing the dealership documents with rapid, enthusiastic strokes. She signed the binding sales contract, the luxury tax waivers, and the official state vehicle title. With every single signature, she permanently tied her legal identity, her home address, and her driver's license to a vehicle purchased entirely with stolen United States Treasury funds. The manager cheerfully handed her the heavy key fob and congratulated her on her beautiful new car. She walked out to the matte black sports car, entirely unaware that she was not driving away in a status symbol. She was driving away in a highly visible $90,000 piece of state evidence that would eventually secure her a cell in a federal penitentiary. The pulsing bass of expensive electronic music vibrated through the manicured hedges of my property long before I even reached the driveway. Morgan had wasted absolutely no time. She was throwing a massive, aggressively lavish housewarming party to showcase the $90,000 sports car sitting proudly in the center of the circular driveway. The matte black vehicle was roped off with velvet stanchions like a museum exhibit, bathed in the glow of rented theatrical uplighting. Dozens of people I had never seen before, wealthy country club acquaintances and superficial socialites, spilled out onto the front lawn, holding crystal champagne flutes and laughing too loudly. The entire event was a grotesque display of unearned wealth, a desperate attempt by Morgan to cement her status in a social circle that would discard her the second her money vanished. I stepped out of the town car, adjusting my suit jacket, and walked up the paved path toward the front door. The irony was not lost on me. I was attending a housewarming party as an uninvited guest at the exact house I had paid off completely a decade ago. I walked through the heavy oak front doors without knocking, slipping past a hired bartender carrying a tray of artisanal appetizers. The interior of the house had been completely transformed in just a few days. My antique leather armchairs had been replaced by sterile white modern sofas. The family photos that once lined the hallway were gone, replaced by massive abstract paintings that reeked of generic corporate wealth. Morgan was standing in the center of the sunken living room, holding court among a group of impeccably dressed women. She was wearing a stunning emerald green cocktail dress, undoubtedly purchased with my corporate card, and gesturing animatedly as she recounted a fabricated story about her recent successes. Cameron stood a few feet away, looking uncomfortable and constantly checking his phone, a prop in her elaborate theatrical performance. I did not attempt to blend in or wait to be noticed. I walked deliberately into the center of the room, stopping directly in front of Morgan Group. The conversation died instantly, as the women turned to stare at the older black man standing confidently amidst their luxury. Morgan's smile froze and then shattered completely. Her face flushed an ugly, mottled red as she realized her meticulously constructed reality was being invaded. She stepped forward immediately, going on the offensive before anyone could ask who I was. She loudly demanded to know what I was doing there, attempting to project an image of annoyed authority. She turned to her friends, waving her hand dismissively, and introduced me as her husband, unfortunate senile father who had recently become prone to wandering. The sheer audacity of her lie was staggering. She then snapped her fingers, signaling two large men in black suits standing near the kitchen entrance. Private security. She had actually hired muscle to protect the assets she stole from me. She aggressively ordered the guards to escort me off the premises, immediately claiming I was trespassing and causing a disturbance. She leaned in close to me, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper, and hissed that if I did not leave voluntarily, she would have me thrown onto the street and call the police to report me as a dangerous vagrant. Cameron finally looked up from his phone. He saw the security guards approaching me, but he did not intervene. He simply took a step back, literally distancing himself from the confrontation. He was allowing his wife to physically eject his father from his own home. I looked at the two large men advancing toward me and raised a single hand, halting them in their tracks. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply informed them that I was the sole registered owner of this property, and if they laid a single hand on me, I would press charges for assault and battery. The guards hesitated, exchanging confused looks with each other. They were hired to handle unruly party guests, not to engage in complex property disputes with calm, well-dressed homeowners. Morgan let out a shrill laugh of disbelief, turning to her friends with a look of exaggerated pity. She loudly mocked my statement, declaring it was just another tragic symptom of my worsening dementia. She insisted to the entire room that she and Cameron owned the house outright and that my delusions were becoming violent. While she ranted, I took a moment to clinically observe the room. I cataloged the high-end catering equipment, the expensive floral arrangements, the new designer furniture, and the crystal champagne glasses in everyone's hands. Every single item in this room, every element of this lavish party was paid for with stolen United States Treasury funds. She had literally invited dozens of witnesses to an active crime scene. Her arrogance had blinded her to the basic principles of financial discretion. She was parading her felonies in front of a crowd, completely unaware that the federal government was already meticulously tracking every single penny she had spent. Her aggressive performance was not a display of power. It was the desperate flailing of a woman caught in a trap she did not yet realize had closed. I did not engage in a shouting match. I did not attempt to correct her lies in front of her superficial friends. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a single sealed manila envelope. I held it out toward her, maintaining direct, unyielding eye contact. I told her in a voice low enough that only she and Cameron could hear that she needed to enjoy the champagne while it lasted because the bill was coming due much sooner than she anticipated. I did not wait for her to take it. I simply dropped the envelope onto the sleek glass coffee table between us. I turned around and walked out of the house with the same deliberate calm I had entered with. I did not look back at the security guards or the silent staring guests. I walked past the $90,000 sports car in the driveway and stepped back into my waiting town car. Inside the house, I knew exactly what Morgan was doing. She would rip open the envelope expecting another fake eviction notice or a desperate plea for money. Instead, she would find a single printed bank statement for the corporate account she had been pillaging. The statement would show a current available balance of absolute zero. Stamped across the top in bold red letters would be two words that would completely destroy her reality: federal hold. Her financial freefall had officially begun. Monday morning arrived with the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. The extravagant housewarming party had left the property littered with empty champagne bottles, discarded crystal glasses, and half-eaten artisanal appetizers. The lead caterer stood in the grand foyer holding a digital payment terminal and a final invoice for exactly $12,000. Morgan, nursing a severe hangover and wearing a luxurious silk designer robe, confidently handed over the solid black corporate card. She expected the massive transaction to process instantly, just as it had at the luxury car dealership a few days prior. The caterer swiped the card. The terminal beeped a sharp, unpleasant tone. The digital screen flashed a bright red error message indicating the transaction was firmly denied. Morgan frowned, deeply annoyed by the minor inconvenience affecting her morning routine. She aggressively snatched the heavy metal card back, wiped the magnetic strip on her silk sleeve, and ordered the caterer to run it again. She blamed the catering company, faulty, outdated equipment, entirely convinced her stolen federal funds were completely limitless. The caterer manually typed in the embossed silver numbers. The machine paused, connecting to the secure banking network before emitting the exact same sharp, rejecting beep. The screen did not just read "declined" this time. It displayed a specific fatal error code instructing the merchant to seize the card immediately and contact the authorities. Morgan scoffed loudly, attempting to mask her sudden surge of deep internal panic with toxic, misplaced indignation. She marched over to her expensive designer handbag and pulled out her personal platinum credit card. She thrust it into the caterer hand, loudly complaining about the staggering incompetence of modern banking technology. The caterer swiped her personal card. Declined. Morgan's face flushed a deep mottled red as her frustration escalated. She grabbed her personal debit card. Declined. She ran up the hardwood stairs to the master bedroom, snatched Cameron's leather wallet from his nightstand, and retrieved his primary credit cards and backup business accounts. She rushed back down the stairs and forced the caterer to run every single piece of plastic they possessed. Every single swipe resulted in the same jarring red rejection screen. The lead caterer's polite professional demeanor evaporated completely. He informed Morgan that if the $12,000 invoice was not settled within the hour, he would call the local authorities and press criminal charges for felony theft of services. Morgan screamed at him to get out of her house, swearing she would go to the bank, withdraw the cash in person, and have his entire catering business shut down by the end of the week. She dressed frantically, grabbed the keys to her new $90,000 sports car, and sped dangerously to the local luxury branch of her commercial bank. She bypassed the waiting line, entirely marching directly up to the main teller window with unearned authority. She slammed the stack of useless plastic cards onto the polished marble counter. She demanded that the teller immediately override the system block and release her funds. She yelled that she was a highly valued customer, that her husband was a successful architect, and that the bank was illegally holding her money hostage. The young teller nervously typed Morgan account details into the system. The color instantly drained from the teller face. The computer screen did not show a normal fraud alert or a simple overdraft warning. It displayed a severe flashing federal lock code that prohibited the teller from processing any transactions, answering any questions, or even confirming the account balance. The teller stammered, stating she was legally unauthorized to access the account profile. Morgan exploded. She pounded her fists on the marble counter, shouting at the top of her lungs. She demanded to see the branch manager, immediately creating a massive public spectacle. She threatened to sue the bank, the teller, and the entire corporate entity for intense emotional distress and financial sabotage. She completely failed to realize that every word she screamed was being recorded by the bank high-definition security cameras, adding perfectly time-stamped behavioral evidence to her growing federal indictment. The heavy oak door of the manager office opened. Mr. Harrison, a highly seasoned branch manager with decades of rigid corporate compliance experience, stepped out onto the banking floor. He did not offer Morgan a reassuring smile. He did not apologize for the inconvenience or attempt to de-escalate her escalating tantrum with soothing customer service platitudes. He walked methodically behind the teller counter, looked directly at the flashing red code on the terminal screen, and then looked at Morgan with absolute chilling emotional detachment. During my 10 years as a senior fraud risk director, I had trained branch managers exactly like Mr. Harrison. I actively wrote the specific compliance protocols they followed when dealing with high-level financial criminals who thought they could bully their way out of a freeze. Federal banking regulations dictate strict, unyielding procedures when an account is officially flagged for federal wire fraud and government embezzlement. If a bank employee discloses the nature of an active federal investigation to the suspect, they commit a severe federal crime known as tipping off. They are legally forbidden from explaining the mechanics of the freeze, offering any financial assistance, or engaging in any dialogue that might compromise the active federal law enforcement operation. Mr. Harrison understood this regulatory boundary perfectly. He instructed the terrified teller to step away from the window and log out of the station. He looked at Morgan, whose chest was heaving with toxic indignation, and informed her in a flat, monotone voice that the bank could not process any transactions, provide any cash withdrawals, or offer any customer support regarding her financial portfolio. He stated plainly that her access to the international banking network was permanently suspended. Morgan stared at him in absolute uncomprehending shock. Her aggressive bullying tactics had always worked on local retail workers and intimidated service staff. She could not fathom a reality where a massive corporate entity flatly refused to bend to her demands. She shrieked that she needed her money right this second, slamming her diamond-ringed hand against the protective bulletproof glass divider. She demanded an immediate detailed explanation for the lockout, threatening to call her lawyers and the local news stations. Mr. Harrison did not raise his voice or flinch at her threats. He simply reached under the polished counter and pulled out a single standardized corporate form. He slid the piece of paper through the metal transaction slot, pushing it deliberately toward her trembling hands. He stated that the bank was officially terminating its financial relationship with her and her husband, effective immediately. Morgan snatched the paper, preparing to rip it to shreds in a final act of theatrical defiance. Then she read the bold black text printed across the top of the heavy parchment. It was a formal notification of a complete asset freeze executed under the severe authority of the USA Patriot Act. The document explicitly stated that all funds connected to her identity, including her husband, joint accounts, his direct deposits, and her father-linked business transfers had been seized by federal authorities pending an active criminal investigation into interstate wire fraud and embezzlement of government funds. Mr. Harrison calmly instructed her to leave the premises immediately, or he would have armed federal security guards escort her out in handcuffs. Morgan stood completely frozen in the pristine bank lobby. The heavy, crushing weight of reality finally shattered her fragile delusion of absolute power. She possessed no cash, no functioning credit cards, and no accessible bank accounts. In a single devastating second, her entire financial existence had been completely and irrevocably erased from the global banking system. Morgan stumbled out of the bank lobby and practically fell into the driver's seat of her matte black sports car. Her hands shook violently as she gripped the leather steering wheel, trying to process the catastrophic reality of the Patriot Act freeze. Before she could even start the engine, her cell phone began to ring with a jarring, frantic tone. The caller ID displayed her father, Richard Sterling. She answered the call, expecting him to offer a comforting solution or perhaps a temporary loan to cover her catering catastrophe. Instead, Richard screamed into the receiver with a level of sheer panic she had never heard before. He frantically explained that a fleet of black sport utility vehicles had just swarmed his commercial construction yard. Agents wearing jackets emblazoned with the IRS Criminal Investigation logo had forcibly chained the front gates and seized every single piece of heavy machinery he owned. They impounded his backhoes, his commercial trucks, and his entire inventory of building materials. Richard demanded to know exactly what she had done. The federal agents had just informed him that the $65,000 wire transfer she sent to bail out his failing business was officially classified as stolen United States Treasury funds. Morgan did not answer. She disconnected the call, dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, and sped back to the house in a state of absolute terror. She burst through the heavy oak front doors of the house, expecting to find the caterer still waiting for his money. Instead, she found Cameron pacing furiously in the center of the living room, clutching his leather wallet and glaring at his phone screen. He had just attempted to buy a simple cup of coffee and suffered the exact same humiliating public decline. He looked up as Morgan entered, his face twisted into a mask of aggressive confusion, and demanded to know why his personal checking account, his business credit lines, and his secret emergency funds were all suddenly showing a zero balance. Morgan did not offer comfort or a rational explanation. Operating purely on a toxic surge of defensive adrenaline, she immediately went on the offensive. She screamed that the financial collapse was entirely his fault. She accused him of being a weak, pathetic man who could not even properly control his own elderly father. She blamed him for allowing Lamar to somehow sabotage their bank accounts instead of securing the pension transfer documents like he promised. Cameron stepped forward, his voice rising to match her hysterical volume. He shouted that she was the one who arrogantly stole the black corporate cards at the restaurant against his better judgment. He reminded her that he had warned her to take it slow, but she had insisted on buying a $90,000 sports car and booking luxury vacations. He aggressively pointed out that his name was on the joint accounts she used to funnel the stolen money, meaning her reckless greed had now legally implicated him in whatever catastrophic financial mess she had created. The thin, superficial veneer of their marriage completely shattered under the crushing weight of impending poverty. There was no foundation of mutual respect or genuine love to sustain them through a crisis. They tore into each other viciously, exchanging deeply personal insults and weaponizing every insecurity they possessed. Cameron called her a parasitic gold digger who had ruined his life and jeopardized his architectural career. Morgan retaliated by mocking his meager salary, declaring she deeply regretted marrying a middle-class coward who had to rely on his basement-dwelling father to pay off a mortgage. The screaming match echoed through the newly decorated house, a violent collision of two incredibly selfish people realizing they were both entirely doomed. They were no longer a united front. They were two cornered criminals desperately trying to throw the other under the bus to save their own skin. Cameron grabbed his car keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the front door so hard the glass panes rattled in their frames. He drove away, leaving Morgan standing alone in the center of the lavishly decorated living room she could no longer afford. Morgan stood in the oppressive silence of the empty house, her chest heaving as she stared at the luxury furniture she had purchased with stolen money. To truly understand Morgan, one must understand the profound, terrifying emptiness that resided at her core. Her entire personality, her social standing, and her aggressive superiority complex were entirely constructed upon a fragile foundation of fake wealth. She had grown up watching her father desperately juggle business loans and default on construction contracts while pretending to be a successful local tycoon. She internalized the toxic lesson that appearances were the only currency that actually mattered in the world. She relentlessly curated her life for social media, projecting the polished image of a wealthy, affluent wife who lunched at country clubs and wore imported designer labels. Without the immediate access to unlimited funds, Morgan possessed absolutely no identity. The Patriot Act freeze did not just take her money, it violently stripped away the only armor she had against her deep-seated insecurities. Faced with the immediate prospect of genuine poverty, she did not feel remorse or a sudden desire to seek redemption. She reacted exactly like a vicious, cornered animal. The survival instinct that had driven her to manipulate Cameron and exploit his father now shifted into absolute overdrive. She realized Cameron was a sinking ship and she had absolutely no intention of drowning with him. She wiped the tears of frustration from her face and coldly calculated her next move. She needed liquid cash immediately to hire a defense attorney and flee the state before the federal agents inevitably arrived at her doorstep. She needed an asset large enough to fund her escape, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Morgan retrieved her cell phone and dialed a number she had found on a cheap neon flyer stapled to a telephone pole weeks ago. It was a predatory real estate investment firm that specialized in aggressive cash for homes transactions, promising immediate payouts for properties with no questions asked and no lengthy inspections. She arranged for an urgent appraisal, telling the dispatcher she was facing a sudden family emergency and needed to liquidate her primary residence by the end of the day. Less than 2 hours later, a sleek silver sedan pulled into the driveway, parking directly behind the illegally purchased sports car. A man wearing a cheap suit and carrying a digital clipboard stepped out. He was exactly the type of shady, opportunistic investor Morgan needed to execute her final desperate ploy. She greeted him at the door, putting on a masterful performance of a highly motivated seller looking for a quick, discreet transaction. She walked him through the sprawling 4-bedroom colonial house, pointing out the recent upgrades and the high-end fixtures, attempting to maximize the immediate cash value. She kept glancing out the front window, praying Cameron would not return home and interrupt the appraisal. Her plan was entirely ruthless. She intended to sell the property out from under her husband, take the massive wire transfer to an offshore account, and completely abandon Cameron to face the federal fraud charges alone. She handed the investor the forged quitclaim deed, confident that the document gave her the absolute legal authority to sell the property today. She smiled as the investor reviewed the paperwork, completely unaware that she was about to step into the final, devastating phase of my trap. The shady real estate investor walked slowly through the spacious first floor of the house, tapping his digital clipboard with a stylus. He wore a cheap, shiny suit and had the distinct, calculating posture of a man who preyed exclusively on desperate homeowners. He ran his eyes over the newly installed marble countertops, the high-end lighting fixtures, and the expensive hardwood floors, taking mental inventory of the sheer luxury Morgan had financed with stolen money. Morgan followed closely behind him, hovering anxiously while projecting her best facade of a wealthy wife simply looking to downsize. The investor paused near the grand staircase, asking pointed questions about the glaring absence of her husband during such a massive financial transaction. Morgan did not miss a beat. She smoothly lied, claiming Cameron was currently out of the state, securing a lucrative commercial architectural contract, and had granted her full administrative authority to liquidate their primary residence. She pushed the forged quitclaim deed toward the investor, emphasizing that she was willing to accept a cash offer significantly below market value if the wire transfer could be completely finalized before the close of business today. The investor smiled greedily, smelling the blood in the water. He loved motivated sellers who prioritize speed over actual property value. He agreed to the severely discounted price and pulled out his cell phone to initiate the final step of his aggressive purchasing process. The investor dialed the direct number for his preferred title company, stepping into the formal dining room to request an expedited title clearance check. In the predatory cash for homes industry, a clean property title is the absolute non-negotiable foundation of every single transaction. He needed to verify that the deed was free of massive liens and properly registered under Morgan and Cameron names before he transferred a single dollar. Morgan stood in the living room attempting to calm her racing heart. She mentally began packing her designer luggage, calculating exactly how fast she could drive her sports car across the state line once the illicit cash hit a newly opened offshore account. She believed she had successfully outmaneuvered everyone. The investor spoke in low, rapid tones to his title agent. Suddenly, his entire physical demeanor shifted violently. The smug, greedy smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a stark, rigid expression of absolute terror. He stared at the forged quitclaim deed resting on the glass coffee table, as if it were a highly venomous snake preparing to strike. He began pacing aggressively, rubbing the back of his neck while listening to his agent list the catastrophic legal realities attached to the property. His voice rose from a quiet whisper to a panicked shout, demanding his agent confirm the information a second time. He abruptly disconnected the call and marched back into the living room, his face flushed with a furious defensive adrenaline. He did not offer Morgan a lower price or attempt to negotiate a different closing timeline. He aggressively threw the forged quitclaim deed across the coffee table, scattering a stack of expensive magazines. He shouted that Morgan was completely out of her mind for trying to drag his investment firm into a massive federal property crime. He accused her of trying to set him up to take the fall for an illegal title transfer. Morgan took a shocked step backward, stammering that she had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. She insisted the deed was perfectly legal and signed by her husband. The investor laughed, a harsh barking sound of pure disbelief. He screamed that the paperwork she handed him was not just a fake. It was a guaranteed one-way ticket to federal prison for anyone foolish enough to file it at the county clerk office. He backed toward the front door, pointing a trembling finger at her. He threatened to call the police right that very second and report her for attempted real estate fraud if she ever contacted his firm again. He ripped open the heavy oak front door and sprinted down the driveway, getting into his silver sedan. He peeled out of the driveway, leaving dark tire marks on the concrete. Morgan reached out a trembling hand, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. She stared at the discarded piece of paper fluttering on the floor, completely unable to process the violent rejection. She had offered a pristine property for a fraction of its true value, and the greedy investor had run away as if the house itself were on fire. The heavy oak door stood wide open, letting the cold afternoon wind sweep through the luxurious foyer, chilling her down to her bones. The reason the opportunistic investor fled in absolute terror was rooted in a financial safeguard I established long before Morgan ever manipulated her way into my family. During my extensive career as a senior fraud risk director, I specialized in protecting high-value assets from aggressive corporate raids and malicious legal seizures. When I completely paid off the mortgage on the house 10 years ago, I did not simply leave the deed sitting exposed in a standard filing cabinet. I utilized my deep knowledge of federal asset protection and placed the entire property into an irrevocable generation-skipping trust. This highly specialized legal entity completely removes the asset from my personal taxable estate and deliberately bypasses Cameron entirely. The trust was rigidly engineered to transfer the property directly to any future grandchildren, securely shielding the home from predatory spouses, severe bankruptcy proceedings, or reckless financial behavior. The most critical feature of an irrevocable trust is its absolute permanence. Once the property is securely locked inside the legal framework, it cannot be sold, modified, borrowed against, or transferred by anyone. Not even I possess the independent authority to alter the deed without a comprehensive legal review and a federal judge's explicit signature. Therefore, the quitclaim deed Cameron arrogantly forged in his desperate attempt to appease his wife was a completely worthless piece of paper. He essentially forged a transfer for a massive physical asset that legally belonged to a heavily fortified independent legal entity. The county records explicitly flagged the property title, warning any potential buyer or title agent that an unauthorized transfer attempt constituted a severe federal offense. Morgan believed she was cunningly stealing a valuable house, but she was actually trying to sell a federal fortress with a counterfeit key. Morgan stood completely immobilized in the grand foyer, staring blankly at the worthless forged document resting on her imported rug. The deafening silence of the massive colonial house pressed down on her from every single angle. The brilliant illusion of her affluent reality was dissolving violently before her eyes, leaving nothing but the terrifying wreckage of her own arrogance. She slowly walked to the front window and looked out at the custom matte black sports car parked proudly in the circular driveway. It was no longer a symbol of her elite social status. It was a highly visible tracking beacon actively tethering her identity to stolen United States Treasury funds. It was a ticking time bomb waiting for federal agents to arrive with an impound tow truck. She picked up her cell phone, attempting to access any hidden reserve of capital, but every banking application displayed the same chilling Patriot Act freeze notification. She could not buy a plane ticket. She could not rent a cheap motel room. She could not even afford the gasoline required to drive her stolen vehicle across the state line. Her father's commercial construction business was currently being dismantled by relentless IRS investigators directly because of her selfish actions. Cameron had abandoned her, choosing to flee into the city rather than face the catastrophic fallout of their ruined marriage. She was left standing completely alone in a sprawling, luxurious house she absolutely did not own. She possessed no accessible money, no functional vehicle, no loyal allies, and absolutely no viable avenue of escape. The meticulously constructed walls of her fake empire had collapsed entirely, trapping her inside. She was finally forced to realize that her relentless greed had not elevated her to the top of society, but had successfully buried her alive. Morgan could not use the $90,000 sports car sitting in the driveway. The federal tracking on the vehicle made it a rolling beacon for law enforcement. Instead, she managed to scrape together just enough loose cash from Cameron's abandoned coin jar to rent a cheap, dented compact car from a discount agency on the edge of town. She sped through the city streets, gripped by sheer panic, and parked the rusted vehicle illegally in front of the grand entrance of the St. Regis Hotel. The valet stepped forward to reprimand her, but she shoved past him, completely ignoring the luxury protocols she usually worshipped. She looked absolutely frantic. Her designer silk robe had been hastily replaced with wrinkled sweatpants and a stained sweater. Her meticulously styled hair was now a chaotic, tangled mess, and her expensive makeup was heavily smudged around her bloodshot eyes. She marched into the opulent marble lobby, looking less like a wealthy socialite and more like a desperate fugitive. She frantically scanned the high vaulted room, ignoring the disgusted stares of the wealthy patrons she so desperately wanted to emulate. She spotted me sitting calmly in the same velvet booth I had occupied yesterday. She practically ran across the lounge, her high heels clicking erratically against the polished floor, driven by the sheer terror of her collapsing reality. She collapsed into the leather chair across from me, breathing heavily as if she had just run a marathon. The aggressive, commanding posture she had displayed at the restaurant was completely gone, replaced by the frantic twitching of a cornered animal. She leaned across the polished mahogany table and began to beg. She pleaded with me to call the bank and lift the Patriot Act freeze, sobbing loudly about how her father's construction business was being torn apart by IRS agents. She promised to return the sports car, to cancel the vacation to the Maldives, and to never speak to me disrespectfully again if I just gave her back access to her life. She claimed Cameron had pressured her into making those purchases. I did not offer her a napkin for her tears or a single word of comfort. I sat perfectly still, holding my cup of dark coffee, and watched her perform. When my absolute silence yielded no results, her begging rapidly dissolved back into the toxic manipulation she was so accustomed to using. Her tear-stained face twisted into a snarl of desperate rage. She aggressively pointed a trembling finger at my chest and threatened to march directly to the local police precinct. She hissed that she would file a formal report accusing me of severe financial abuse and domestic manipulation. She claimed she would tell the authorities that I had willingly given her the black cards and then maliciously reported them stolen to ruin her father's business and destroy her marriage. She genuinely believed she could still bully her way out of a federal indictment with a fabricated local police report. I set my coffee cup down precisely on its saucer. I looked directly into her frantic, bloodshot eyes and clinically deconstructed her entire delusion. I informed her in a low, steady voice that the local police lacked any jurisdiction to intervene in a federal money laundering investigation. I meticulously listed her crimes in chronological order, breaking down her financial suicide step by step. I reminded her that she stole the cards in a crowded restaurant surrounded by dozens of eyewitnesses and high-definition security cameras. I detailed her staggering $65,000 wire transfer to explicitly explain how that single transaction legally contaminated her father's commercial accounts with illicit capital. I reminded her of the $90,000 sports car sitting in my driveway, legally registered under her name and firmly tied to a stolen financial instrument. I explained that her desperate attempt to liquidate a property held in an irrevocable generation-skipping trust constituted a massive real estate felony on top of her existing charges. I continued by dismantling her absurd defense. I explained that no rational investigator would ever believe a retired banking executive willingly handed over corporate expense cards to a daughter-in-law who openly mocked him in public. I pointed out that the bank possessed a pristine audio recording of the fraud verification call. I asked her how she planned to explain to a federal judge why she explicitly impersonated my deceased wife to authorize the wire transfer to her father company. The mention of the recorded phone call completely shattered her remaining defiance. She shrank back into the leather booth, her breathing shallow and ragged. She finally understood that she had not outsmarted anyone. Every single move she made had been anticipated, observed, and legally weaponized against her. Morgan sat immobilized in the velvet booth, staring at me with a vacant, terrified expression. She weakly stammered that I had to undo the damage because the money belonged to me and I had the power to simply drop the charges. She desperately reasoned that since it was just family money, I could call the bank, declare the funds a gift, and make the entire investigation disappear before anyone went to prison. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, bridging the physical distance between us to deliver the final, crushing truth. I spoke with absolute, chilling clarity, ensuring every single word registered in her panicking brain. I informed her that the black cards she stole from my wallet did not hold my personal retirement savings. I explained that those specific accounts were entirely disconnected from my private wealth. I revealed that the cards were issued by a federally monitored limited liability company established exclusively to distribute institutional grants. I watched her eyes widen in pure horror as I explained the true origin of the capital she had so carelessly squandered on designer shoes and a matte black sports car. I told her the money she funneled into her father's failing construction business was explicitly allocated by the United States Treasury to fund emergency housing initiatives for disabled military veterans. I clarified that she had not stolen a single dime of my personal money. She had stolen directly from the federal government. I watched her process the sheer magnitude of her error. Stealing from a family member is a civil dispute, but stealing federal grant money designated for veterans elevates the crime to a high-priority national security matter. The agencies investigating her were not local detectives who could be bribed or manipulated with fake tears. They were highly specialized federal agents who operated with absolute ruthless efficiency and possessed limitless resources to prosecute individuals who misappropriated government funds. The absolute gravity of the situation finally crashed down on Morgan, completely suffocating her. She was no longer breathing normally. She was taking short, frantic gasps of air as if the oxygen in the luxury lounge had suddenly evaporated. The illusion of the helpless, senile father-in-law she thought she was exploiting dissolved entirely, leaving behind the terrifying reality of a retired risk director who had expertly guided her to her own slaughter. She had arrogantly assumed she was bullying an old man out of his meager pension to fund her superficial country club lifestyle. She now understood she had actively triggered a massive federal response by plundering the United States Treasury. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for defrauding a federal veteran initiative flashed invisibly before her eyes. There would be no slap on the wrist, no suspended sentence, and absolutely no way to leverage her fake social status to avoid prison. Her father's construction company would be entirely liquidated by the government to replace the stolen grant money. She had single-handedly orchestrated the absolute financial and legal destruction of her entire family in less than 72 hours. Morgan clutched her stomach, physically nauseated by the inescapable trap she had willingly walked into. She looked at me not with the toxic superiority she had paraded at the anniversary dinner, but with the sheer unadulterated terror of a criminal who realizes the executioner has already pulled the lever. She slowly stood up from the booth, her legs trembling violently, unable to support her own weight. The realization that she had robbed the federal government paralyzed her mind. She turned and blindly staggered toward the hotel exit, leaving the luxury lounge like a ghost walking toward a graveyard. I took a slow sip of my dark coffee, maintaining unbroken eye contact until she disappeared through the glass doors. She was heading back out into a world where federal agents were already waiting to tear her life apart. Cameron sat in the sterile confines of his architectural firm, trying frantically to bypass the digital lock on his frozen bank accounts. The aggressive red banners glaring from his computer monitor offered zero explanations. His desk phone rang with a shrill urgency. He answered the line expecting a wealthy client, but was instead assaulted by Morgan, frantic, hysterical sobbing. She was practically hyperventilating as she screamed into the receiver about the United States Treasury federal agents and veteran housing grants. The fragmented, terrifying pieces of information rapidly assembled themselves in Cameron's mind. He finally understood the catastrophic origin of the black corporate cards his wife had stolen. The money did not belong to his father. It belonged to the federal government. A deep, sickening wave of pure terror washed over him as he logged into his archived digital statements. He stared at the routing numbers associated with the massive wire transfers Morgan had processed. She had used their primary joint checking account to initially receive and then funnel the stolen government capital to her father's construction business. Cameron's name was permanently registered on that exact account as a primary authorized user. The federal banking algorithm did not distinguish between a mastermind and a passive beneficiary. In the eyes of the law, he was officially a co-conspirator in a massive interstate embezzlement scheme. His entire architectural career, his reputation, and his freedom evaporated in a single heartbeat. Driven by sheer unadulterated panic, Cameron abandoned his office and sped directly to the St. Regis Hotel. He bypassed the valet parking his car haphazardly along the curb and sprinted through the grand marble lobby. He spotted me sitting calmly in the outdoor courtyard garden, enjoying the cool afternoon breeze. The arrogant, entitled architect who had sneered at me across a diner table just days ago was completely gone. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive tie was askew, his tailored shirt was soaked in nervous sweat, and his hands trembled violently as he approached my table. He collapsed into the wrought iron chair across from me, abandoning any remaining shred of his false dignity. He immediately began to weep. The tears streamed down his face as he launched into a desperate, frantic plea for salvation. He begged for mercy, claiming he had been completely blinded by Morgan's toxic ambition. He aggressively threw his wife under the bus, shifting the entirety of the blame onto her shoulders. He swore he had absolutely no idea she was stealing federal grant money meant for disabled veterans. He insisted Morgan had manipulated him emotionally, threatened to divorce him, and forced him to sign the forged quitclaim deed under extreme psychological duress. He sobbed loudly, clutching the edge of the table, and pleaded with me to use my extensive federal connections to intervene on his behalf. He offered to completely betray the woman he had vowed to protect. He promised to turn state evidence and testify aggressively against Morgan in federal court. He swore he would provide the prosecutors with every single detail of her financial crimes, hand over all her personal electronic devices, and testify against her father's corrupt construction business. He begged me to call Alistair Pierce and the federal authorities to officially declare that I recognized Cameron as an unwitting victim of spousal manipulation. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I just shielded him from the impending federal indictment. He cried that he could not survive in a federal penitentiary, that his life would be entirely destroyed, and that he was still my son who desperately needed his father's protection. He reached across the table, attempting to grab my hand, seeking the unconditional paternal comfort he had so callously discarded at the anniversary dinner. He genuinely believed his tears would instantly reactivate the decades of blind sacrifice I had freely given him. He thought he could simply erase his participation in my financial execution by playing the role of a frightened child. He babbled incoherently about how we could fix this quietly, how we could return the remaining funds and sweep the forgery under the rug before the authorities finalized their paperwork. He promised to move me back into the master bedroom and care for me forever if I just made the terrifying federal freeze disappear. I did not offer him my hand. I pulled back slightly, resting my arms on the armrests of my chair, and observed him with absolute clinical detachment. There was a time when seeing Cameron cry would have shattered my heart. I would have moved heaven and earth, drained my savings, and sacrificed my own well-being to shield him from any pain. But that father was dead. He had died in the upscale steakhouse when Cameron stared at his food and allowed his wife to publicly degrade me. I looked at the weeping man sitting across from me and felt absolutely nothing. I did not see a son seeking redemption. I saw a compromised liability attempting to negotiate his way out of a severe criminal penalty. He was not crying because he felt genuine remorse for betraying his father. He was not apologizing for forging a legal document to steal my home, or for attempting to force me into a psychiatric facility. He was crying solely because the consequences of his extreme greed had finally caught up to him. He was terrified of losing his comfortable lifestyle and facing the brutal reality of a prison cell. I analyzed his frantic behavior the same way I used to analyze corrupt banking executives cornered by an audit. He was a parasite who had willingly consumed the spoils of the theft when he believed the victim was a helpless old man. Now that the victim was the federal government, he was desperately trying to sever the infected limb to save himself. His sudden display of loyalty was nothing more than a calculated survival tactic generated by profound cowardice. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and slowly withdrew my cell phone. I did not raise my voice or offer him a single word of false comfort. I simply unlocked the device, opened the secure audio file Alistair had prepared, and placed the phone flat on the courtyard table. I pressed play. The crystal-clear recording of our conversation at the diner filled the space between us. Cameron's own voice echoed sharply from the speaker, aggressively defending Morgan theft. The recording captured him coldly, declaring that I was an unbearable burden to his marriage, justifying the forged signature on the quitclaim deed, and threatening to lock me in a state-run nursing facility if I did not surrender my remaining assets. The audio played his explicit admission that he was eagerly expediting my inheritance to avoid probate taxes. Cameron stopped crying instantly. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him a ghostly pale white. He stared at the phone in absolute horrified silence, listening to his own arrogant words permanently sealing his fate. He realized in that devastating moment that his claims of innocent manipulation were entirely useless. I had meticulously documented his willing participation in the conspiracy from the very beginning. I tapped the screen to stop the playback and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at him with cold finality. I informed him that I do not commit perjury for convicted felons. I stood up from the table, adjusted my jacket, and walked away without looking back. I left him sitting completely paralyzed in the courtyard, utterly abandoned and waiting for the federal agents to arrive. The wealthy suburban neighborhood of Whispering Pines was completely silent at 5 in the morning. The manicured lawns sparkled with fresh morning dew under the soft glow of ornate street lamps. There were no garbage trucks or delivery vans allowed at this hour. It was a pristine, heavily guarded enclave designed specifically to keep the harsh realities of the world firmly outside its wrought iron gates. The absolute tranquility was abruptly shattered by the synchronized arrival of 6 unmarked black sport utility vehicles. They did not use their sirens to announce their approach. They moved with a terrifying tactical silence, rolling down the immaculate street in a tight convoy. The heavy vehicles swerved sharply into the wide circular driveway of the sprawling colonial house, blocking every possible exit. Simultaneously, a heavy armored transport truck parked directly across the street. Dozens of federal agents wearing tactical gear emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS stepped out into the crisp morning air. The heavy thud of their tactical boots hitting the pavement echoed loudly, breaking the suburban peace. They moved with absolute military precision, securing the perimeter of the property and stacking up against the heavy oak front doors. The illusion of safety Morgan had desperately clung to was about to be violently dismantled. At the exact same moment across the city, a secondary federal task force executed a perfectly synchronized raid on Apex Structural Solutions. Richard Sterling arrived at his construction yard, expecting to find his desperate employees waiting for their delayed paychecks. Instead, he was immediately surrounded by armed IRS criminal investigation agents. They presented a federal warrant seizing his commercial bank accounts, his construction equipment, and all operational assets tied to the stolen government funds. Richard was ordered to his knees, his hands secured tightly behind his back, as agents systematically boxed up his accounting computers and filing cabinets. His entire business legacy was eradicated in less than 10 minutes, a direct casualty of his daughter's arrogant greed. Back at the Colonial House, the lead federal agent raised a heavy steel battering ram and struck the custom oak front door. The expensive wood splintered instantly under the massive force, granting the tactical team immediate entry. The agents flooded into the grand foyer, their flashlights piercing the dim interior. They spread out across the first floor, securing the living room, the dining area, and the kitchen. Agents began aggressively cataloging the luxury furniture, the crystal champagne flutes, and the expensive abstract artwork Morgan had recently purchased with stolen United States Treasury capital. Every single item paid for with the black corporate cards was officially tagged as federal evidence. Outside in the circular driveway, a massive flatbed tow truck backed up slowly toward the $90,000 sports car. The custom matte black vehicle that Morgan had paraded in front of her country club friends just days ago was now completely surrounded by federal investigators. An agent slapped a bright neon seizure notice directly onto the windshield, officially repossessing the asset on behalf of the government. The heavy steel chains of the tow winch rattled loudly as they were hooked to the undercarriage of the luxury car. The mechanical whine of the winch echoed through the neighborhood, dragging the vehicle up onto the flatbed. The ultimate symbol of Morgan fake wealth was unceremoniously hauled away, stripping her of her primary status symbol before she was even pulled out of bed. The agents moved upstairs with ruthless efficiency. They completely ignored the imported silk rugs and the designer decor, focusing solely on retrieving the digital and physical evidence of the massive interstate wire fraud. They knew exactly what they were looking for because Alistair Pierce had provided them with a flawless, unredacted map of her financial crimes. The federal task force operated without a single ounce of hesitation, entirely dismantling the fraudulent empire Morgan had built on my stolen funds. The violent crash of the front door shattering jolted Morgan awake. She sat up in the master bed, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The loud, authoritative shouts of federal agents echoing up the grand staircase sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror straight through her veins. She realized instantly that the catastrophic consequences I had warned her about were finally knocking at her bedroom door. Cameron was not beside her, having never returned home after his pathetic display at my hotel. She was entirely alone. Panic completely consumed her. She scrambled out of the luxurious silk sheets, her mind racing toward the only piece of damning evidence she thought she could control. Her expensive silver laptop was sitting on the glass vanity. That machine contained the digital trails of the forged quitclaim deed, the fake emails she sent to the bank, and her illicit correspondence with the predatory real estate investor. She grabbed the heavy laptop, raising it high above her head with the desperate, frantic intention of smashing it to pieces against the hardwood floor. She believed destroying the physical hard drive would somehow erase her digital footprints from the federal servers. Before she could bring the machine down, the bedroom door was kicked open. 2 federal agents charged into the room, shouting clear commands to drop the device. Morgan ignored them, blinded by sheer desperation. She swung the laptop downward, but an agent lunged forward, tackling her aggressively to the floor. The laptop skittered safely across the room, retrieved instantly by a cyber forensics expert. Morgan was pinned face down against the expensive imported rug, her arms wrenched behind her back. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped tightly around her wrists. She writhed and screamed, demanding they let her go, shouting that she was a wealthy homeowner and a victim of a massive misunderstanding. The agents completely ignored her hysterical protests, treating her with the cold, rigid detachment reserved for serious federal felons. She was stripped of all her unearned authority, pinned to the ground in her wrinkled pajamas, completely and utterly humiliated. The lead agent hauled Morgan roughly to her feet, reciting her Miranda rights in a flat, mechanical monotone. She was not given the opportunity to change her clothes, fix her disheveled hair, or put on her designer sunglasses. She was marched out of the master bedroom and guided down the grand staircase by 2 stern federal officers. By the time they reached the shattered front door, the sun had fully risen, casting a bright, unforgiving light over the chaotic scene. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the quiet suburban street, drawing the intense attention of the entire neighborhood. Morgan was escorted out onto the manicured front lawn. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up. The wealthy country club acquaintances, the judgmental socialites, and the superficial friends she had desperately tried to impress at her lavish housewarming party were all standing on their porches watching her. They clutched their morning coffees, staring in absolute shock as the woman who claimed to be a high society elite was paraded across her grass in handcuffs. There was no pity in their eyes, only a cold, harsh judgment and a frantic desire to distance themselves from her disgrace. Morgan lowered her head, tears of profound, absolute shame streaming down her face. She realized the true depth of her punishment. I had not just taken her money or her freedom. By letting the federal government handle the execution, I had publicly and permanently destroyed the only thing she truly valued, her social status was dead, and her financial freefall was finally complete. The federal holding facility was a masterclass in psychological pressure and sensory deprivation. The interrogation room consisted entirely of cinderblock walls painted a sickly institutional green, a bolted steel table, and a heavy two-way mirror that offered absolutely no reflection of the outside world. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a relentless, sterile hum, casting harsh shadows that highlighted the deep exhaustion etched into Morgan's face. She had been completely stripped of her designer silk garments and forced into a stiff, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that smelled faintly of industrial bleach and stale sweat. The heavy steel door had locked behind her with a definitive echoing thud, isolating her entirely from the luxurious life she had so desperately fabricated. Despite her catastrophic circumstances, Morgan stubbornly clung to her toxic arrogance. She sat rigidly in the cold metal chair, crossing her arms tightly over her chest and lifting her chin in a pathetic display of manufactured defiance. She genuinely believed her high society persona would somehow shield her from the brutal reality of the federal justice system. She glared at the empty chair across the table, rehearsing her victim narrative, entirely convinced she could simply bully, charm, or manipulate the government agents just as easily as she had manipulated retail workers and dealership managers. The heavy steel door groaned open, admitting a stern, broad-shouldered federal investigator who dropped a thick, heavily redacted case file onto the table. He did not introduce himself or offer her a glass of water. He simply sat down, opened the file, and stared at her with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator evaluating its trapped prey. Morgan immediately launched into her meticulously rehearsed defense. She did not wait for him to ask a single question before she began aggressively throwing her husband under the proverbial bus. She painted herself as a naive, devoted wife who had been entirely manipulated by a controlling and financially abusive spouse. She claimed Cameron was the ruthless mastermind behind the entire operation, insisting he had stolen the black corporate cards from his father and forced her to use them under the threat of severe domestic violence. She wept fabricated tears, spinning a wildly dramatic tale about how Cameron had forged the real estate documents behind her back and coerced her into funneling capital to her father's construction company to secure his own hidden investments. She swore she had absolutely no idea the money belonged to a government grant program, insisting she believed it was merely an early inheritance Cameron was legally entitled to utilize. She demanded total immunity in exchange for her full cooperation, boldly stating she was completely willing to testify against Cameron to ensure he took the entire fall for the financial disaster. The federal investigator let her speak without interruption, his expression remaining perfectly blank as he cataloged every single lie. When she finally ran out of breath, wiping her fake tears on the rough sleeve of her jumpsuit, the heavy steel door opened a second time. The atmosphere in the interrogation room instantly shifted from routine questioning to a high-stakes financial execution. Alistair Pierce walked into the room wearing an immaculate tailored suit and carrying his encrypted federal tablet. He did not look like a standard law enforcement officer. He possessed the sharp clinical aura of a seasoned auditor who had spent decades dismantling complex corporate syndicates. Alistair pulled out a chair and sat directly next to the investigator, placing his tablet on the metal table. Morgan frowned, her false confidence faltering slightly at the sight of this new intimidating presence. She demanded to know who he was and aggressively complained that her defense attorney had not yet arrived. Alistair did not acknowledge her demands. He introduced himself strictly as the consulting forensic auditor assigned directly by the United States Treasury to oversee the recovery of the stolen veteran housing funds. He folded his hands on the table, fixing his piercing blue eyes on her, and stated that her fictional narrative about being a helpless, manipulated wife was mathematically and factually impossible. Alistair began to dismantle her lies with ruthless surgical precision. He tapped the screen of his tablet, pulling up the undeniable digital footprint of her staggering greed. He explained that banking forensics do not rely on emotional testimonies or tearful accusations. They rely on cold, hard, unalterable data. He displayed the precise geographical coordinates, IP addresses, and time-stamped security footage from the luxury car dealership, proving conclusively that Cameron was nowhere near the premises when she aggressively bullied the finance manager into processing the $90,000 transaction. He laid out the digital logs, showing the exact moment the corporate funds were wired to her father, failing construction business, proving the transaction originated directly from her personal mobile device while she was sitting alone in her kitchen. Morgan shifted uncomfortably in her metal chair. her arrogant facade cracking violently as the insurmountable mountain of physical evidence boxed her into an inescapable corner. She stammered, attempting to pivot her crumbling defense by claiming Cameron had instructed her to make those specific purchases over the phone and guided her through the wire transfer. Alistair did not let her finish the desperate lie. He informed her that the federal government does not prosecute major financial crimes based on assumptions or hearsay. They prosecute based on definitive verified proof. He tapped a final command on his tablet, maximizing an encrypted audio file. He stated that a major hurdle in proving wire fraud is confirming the exact identity of the person authorizing the illicit transaction. He told her she had graciously provided them with the exact piece of evidence they needed to secure an ironclad conviction. He pressed play. The pristine, unedited audio recording of the bank compliance call filled the sterile interrogation room. Morgan heard her own voice, brisk and irritated, explicitly identifying herself as Lorraine, the name of my deceased wife. She listened in absolute petrified silence as her recorded voice confidently authorized the massive $65,000 transfer to Apex Structural Solutions, effectively sealing her father's financial ruin and her own criminal fate. The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening, oppressive silence in its wake. Morgan stared at the digital tablet as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at her chest. The irrefutable proof of her identity theft and government fraud had just been played back to her in pristine high definition. The federal investigator leaned forward, clasping his hands together, and delivered the final devastating blow. He informed her that by actively impersonating a deceased individual to bypass a federal banking security protocol, she had instantly elevated her charges from standard wire fraud to aggravated identity theft and the explicit misappropriation of designated government treasury funds. He coldly outlined the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines required by federal law for these specific high-level offenses. He stated with absolute finality that even with a highly skilled defense attorney and a potential plea deal, the sheer magnitude of the stolen capital guaranteed, she was looking at a minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He clarified that there would be no suspended sentence, no comfortable country club halfway house, and absolutely no opportunity for early parole when defrauding a federal veteran initiative. The horrifying reality of a 2-decade prison sentence crashed down on her, completely obliterating the last remaining fragments of her manufactured superiority. She realized she would lose the absolute best years of her life, locked inside a concrete cell, stripped of her makeup, her designer clothes, and her entirely fabricated social status. The arrogant, untouchable socialite finally vanished completely. Morgan slumped forward against the cold steel table, buried her face in her shackled hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. The loud, wretched sounds of her absolute defeat echoed endlessly off the cinderblock walls, serving as a pathetic conclusion to her reign of unimaginable greed. 3 days after the federal raid, a courier delivered a heavy, embossed envelope directly to my hotel suite. The return address belonged to one of the most expensive and aggressive criminal defense firms in the city. Morgan's father, desperate to save his own sinking ship, had clearly liquidated whatever remaining personal assets he possessed to hire a high-powered attorney for his daughter. The letter inside was a formal request for an urgent face-to-face settlement conference. The attorney representing Morgan wanted to negotiate a comprehensive resolution regarding the mounting civil damages I had filed alongside the federal criminal charges. The civil suit was a calculated secondary strike. While the federal prosecutors handled the prison sentence, my civil litigation was systematically freezing. Her father's commercial accounts to ensure every single stolen dollar was returned to the Veteran Housing Fund. The defense lawyer knew they could not beat the federal wire fraud charges, but he was frantically trying to stop the financial bleeding that was currently bankrupting the rest of the Sterling family. I called Alistair Pierce immediately and instructed him to set up the meeting. I had absolutely no intention of negotiating, but I wanted to look her in the eye one last time before the cell door closed forever. The meeting took place the following afternoon in a sterile, windowless conference room located within the Federal Detention Center. Alistair and I sat on one side of a long, scratch-resistant metal table. The heavy security door buzzed open, admitting a slick, sharply dressed defense attorney followed closely by Morgan. She shuffled into the room wearing the same standard-issue orange jumpsuit, her wrists securely bound by heavy steel transport cuffs. The vibrant, arrogant socialite who had terrorized retail workers and commanded private security to throw me out of my own house was entirely gone. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and washed out by the harsh fluorescent lighting. She kept her head bowed, refusing to meet my gaze as she sank heavily into the metal chair across from me. She looked incredibly small, physically diminished by the crushing weight of her impending incarceration. The defense attorney immediately launched into his highly rehearsed pitch, projecting the polished confidence of a man used to bullying victims into quiet settlements. He spoke with a smooth, practiced cadence, utilizing every legal buzzword available to soften the absolute severity of his client actions. He laid out a thick binder of proposed settlement terms, sliding it across the metal table with a patronizing smile. He proposed a comprehensive global plea deal. He stated that Morgan was fully prepared to accept responsibility for her momentary lapse in judgment and would immediately plead guilty to a single reduced charge of localized financial fraud. In exchange, he required me to formally petition the federal prosecutor to drop the aggravated identity theft charges and the specific allegations involving government treasury funds. Furthermore, he demanded that I immediately withdraw my civil lawsuit against Apex Structural Solutions. The attorney argued passionately that liquidating her father's construction business would unfairly punish an innocent family for the isolated mistakes of one highly distressed individual. He leaned forward, attempting to appeal to my sense of paternal compassion. He claimed Morgan was deeply remorseful and that forcing a lengthy, highly publicized federal trial would only bring unnecessary emotional pain to my son and myself. He suggested that dragging this case through a public courtroom would expose my family private matters to the relentless scrutiny of the local media. He promised that if I signed the settlement agreement, Morgan would formally divorce Cameron, leaving him entirely untouched by the financial fallout, and she would quietly serve a minimal 2-year sentence in a minimum security facility. He tapped the thick binder, confident he had presented a perfectly logical escape route for everyone involved. Morgan finally looked up from the metal table. Her eyes were rimmed with dark, exhausted circles. She let out a ragged, desperate breath and whispered a pathetic apology. She choked on her words, swearing she never meant to let things go this far and begging me to spare her father business from total annihilation. She pleaded that her family had absolutely nothing left and that destroying their livelihood would not undo the damage she had caused. She promised to disappear completely from the state the moment she was released if I just showed her a shred of mercy today. She was crying real tears now, stripped of her defensive aggression and reduced to begging a man she once considered utterly disposable. She thought the sight of her broken and humiliated would finally activate the quiet, accommodating victim she had assumed I was at the anniversary dinner. She waited with bated breath, genuinely believing her practiced display of profound misery would secure her a comfortable escape route from a 20-year federal sentence. I sat perfectly still, listening to the steady hum of the ventilation system overhead. I looked at the tears streaming down her pale cheeks and felt absolutely zero compassion. I mentally replayed the exact moment in the crowded steakhouse when she snatched my wallet from the floor and held it up like a trophy. I remembered the sheer toxic delight in her voice when she loudly announced she was cutting off my money to force me into begging. She did not exhibit a single ounce of mercy when she plotted to lock me in a state-run psychiatric facility. She felt no remorse when she attempted to evict me from the home I had paid for with decades of hard work. She had ruthlessly weaponized my age, my quiet demeanor, and my son's cowardice to execute a hostile financial takeover of my life. Mercy is a privilege reserved for those who make honest mistakes, not for predators who meticulously calculate the destruction of vulnerable people. If I had truly been a helpless pensioner relying on a standard retirement fund, her actions would have left me entirely destitute, starving and homeless on the streets. I analyzed her tears the same way I used to analyze fraudulent ledger entries. They were counterfeit. She was not mourning the pain she inflicted on me or the veterans whose funds she stole. She was mourning the loss of her luxury car, the forfeiture of her country club status, and the impending collapse of her father empire. She was crying because she had reached her hand into the dark to steal a wallet and had accidentally grasped the jaws of a steel trap. The only tragedy in her mind was that she had chosen the wrong victim. Giving her a lighter sentence would only teach her to be a more careful criminal in the future. She needed to experience the absolute maximum penalty allowed by federal law to ensure she never financially abused another human being ever again. I looked away from her tear-stained face and focused my gaze entirely on her high-priced defense attorney. I did not raise my voice or lean across the table to intimidate them. I spoke with the icy, unyielding precision of a man who held all the cards. I informed the attorney that I do not negotiate with federal thieves, and I absolutely do not mitigate the consequences for individuals who steal housing funds from disabled veterans. I stated that the civil suit would proceed with maximum aggression, ensuring that every single asset belonging to Apex Structural Solutions was seized, liquidated, and returned to the United States Treasury. I made it explicitly clear that her father construction company would be dismantled brick by brick to pay the massive restitution she incurred. The attorney polished smile vanished instantly, replaced by a tight, angry scowl as he realized his expensive intimidation tactics were completely useless against a veteran risk director. Morgan let out a strangled, horrified gasp, realizing her father's financial ruin was now permanently sealed. She lunged forward against the metal table, the steel transport chains rattling loudly against the surface. She screamed my name, begging me to reconsider, shouting that I was destroying her entire family over a single mistake. I stood up from my chair, buttoned my suit jacket, and looked down at her frantic, trembling form. I calmly informed her that she was the one who destroyed her family the exact moment she swiped that black corporate card to buy a sports car she did not earn. I turned my back on her and walked toward the heavy security door, signaling the guard to open it. I left the sterile conference room without a single backward glance, the echoes of her desperate sobbing ringing hollowly against the concrete walls. There would be no deals, no compromises, and absolutely no mercy. The full weight of the federal justice system was about to crush her completely. Cameron dragged his feet along the paved sidewalk of the Whispering Pines subdivision. The late afternoon sun cast long, mocking shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. He had spent the last 48 hours sequestered in a windowless federal field office, answering aggressive questions from ruthless investigators. He had managed to avoid a direct federal indictment by offering absolute cooperation and completely throwing his wife to the wolves. The prosecutors determined he was a coward, rather than a criminal mastermind, allowing him to walk out of the building without handcuffs. But freedom was the only thing he had left. His bank accounts remained completely frozen under the Patriot Act. His prestigious architectural firm had placed him on indefinite unpaid leave the moment the FBI raided his office. His expensive tailored suit was now wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He possessed no cash, and his luxury vehicle had been impounded during the raid. He had walked 3 miles from the nearest bus stop to return to the sprawling colonial house he falsely claimed as his own. He desperately hoped to find a quiet sanctuary to hide from the devastating wreckage of his shattered life. As Cameron approached the wide circular driveway, his exhausted relief instantly evaporated. The pristine front lawn, previously the stage for Morgan's lavish and arrogant housewarming party, was now littered with a chaotic pile of heavy black garbage bags. The bags were tied haphazardly, bulging with designer clothes, expensive shoes, and the trivial remnants of a fake, affluent lifestyle. He recognized the tailored shirts he had worn to the diner and the expensive Italian leather loafers he had purchased during his wife's reckless spending spree. Cameron quickened his pace, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He stepped over a discarded silk tie that had spilled onto the pristine grass and marched up the brick pathway to the heavy oak front doors. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out his shiny brass house key. He shoved the key into the familiar lock and pushed. The cylinder did not turn. He yanked the key out and looked closer at the hardware. The standard residential locks had been completely removed. In their place sat heavy commercial-grade steel deadbolts, the exact type used to secure bank vaults and federal evidence rooms. There was no keyhole for a standard residential key, only an encrypted digital keypad and a biometric scanner glowing with a faint blue light. Cameron rattled the heavy brass door handle in sheer panic, pushing his shoulder against the solid oak wood. It did not yield a single fraction of an inch. He pounded his fists against the heavy door, shouting for someone to open up, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his professional dignity. A loud mechanical click echoed from the other side. The heavy steel deadbolts retracted with a smooth, decisive thud. The door swung inward, revealing the grand foyer. The ridiculous abstract paintings Morgan had hung were already gone, replaced by the warm, familiar family photographs she had so callously discarded. I stood in the doorway, filling the space, dressed in my usual tailored suit, holding a steaming cup of dark coffee. I did not greet him. I did not step aside to let him enter the cool, air-conditioned sanctuary of the house. I simply looked down at him, standing on the welcome mat, completely surrounded by his bagged belongings. Cameron stared at me, his eyes wide with desperate disbelief. He pointed a shaking finger at the pile of trash bags on the lawn, his voice cracking as he demanded an explanation for why his expensive property was sitting out in the dirt. He angrily demanded that I step aside and let him into his house so he could take a shower and sleep in a real bed. He was still operating under the pathetic delusion that the universe would simply reset, that he could return to the comfortable shelter I had provided him for nearly 40 years without facing any real consequences for his staggering betrayal. When I remained perfectly still, blocking the threshold with unyielding silence, his anger rapidly dissolved back into the pathetic whining of a cornered child. He collapsed onto the front step, burying his face in his hands. He began to weep loudly, begging me for mercy. He cried that he had lost his career, his wife, and his entire reputation. He pleaded for his old childhood bedroom, promising he would stay out of my way, do the yard work, and pay me back every single dime as soon as his accounts were unfrozen. He begged me to be a father, claiming he had absolutely nowhere else to go and no one else to rely on. I looked down at the weeping man on my porch and delivered the harsh, grounding truth he had avoided his entire life. I told him in a low, clinical voice that he stopped being a child the moment he forged his father's signature on a county real estate document. I explained that manhood is not defined by wearing an expensive suit or blindly enabling a toxic spouse. Manhood is defined by absolute accountability. I reminded him that when he sat at that steakhouse and watched his wife publicly humiliate me, he made a conscious choice to prioritize his comfort over my dignity. A real man stands up to cruelty rather than hiding behind a dinner plate while his father is stripped of his humanity. I stated that a true man does not steal from the father who sacrificed decades of his life to keep him debt-free. I told him he had spent his entire adulthood acting like a parasite, feeding off my hard work while projecting a fake image of superiority. The luxury ride was officially over. Cameron looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, genuinely expecting a dramatic reconciliation or a final offer of paternal grace. He extended a trembling hand, waiting for me to pull him up from the concrete step and welcome him back into the safety of the fortress I had built. I did not reach out to him. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I dropped it deliberately onto his lap. Cameron picked it up with shaking fingers. It was not a bank check or a hotel key. It was a printed list of municipal homeless shelters located in the industrial district of the city, accompanied by a standard 30-day local bus pass. The crisp blue edge of the transit card fluttered slightly in the afternoon breeze. I looked directly into his horrified eyes and informed him that the city bus arrived at the corner in exactly 15 minutes. I advised him to gather whatever trash bags he could carry and start walking, because if he remained on my private property after the bus departed, I would instruct the local police to arrest him for trespassing. Cameron opened his mouth to protest, a fresh wave of desperate sobbing rising in his throat. He cried out my name, a final pathetic attempt to invoke the ghost of the father who used to fix all his mistakes. I did not say another word. I stepped back into the quiet, peaceful foyer of my home and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The commercial steel deadbolts engaged automatically with a loud, absolute click, locking him entirely outside in the world he had created for himself. The federal courtroom was a cavernous space of polished mahogany and intimidating judicial authority. The air was heavily conditioned and smelled of floor wax and sterile legal proceedings. Morgan sat at the heavy defense table, looking entirely stripped of her former country club arrogance. Her high-priced defense attorney had instructed her to wear a modest, faded beige blouse and a plain black skirt, attempting to project the image of a humbled, broken woman. She kept her head bowed, clutching a crumpled tissue and occasionally dabbing at her eyes with practiced theatrical timing. She visibly trembled every time the federal prosecutor spoke, playing the role of a highly stressed, overwhelmed victim who had simply buckled under the immense pressure of a failing marriage and a bankrupt father. She wanted the federal judge to look down from the elevated bench and see a fragile housewife who made a single tragic mistake out of desperation. She sniffled loudly, hoping her pathetic display of manufactured misery would somehow override the mountain of undeniable digital forensics stacked against her. The federal prosecutor concluded his final remarks and respectfully yielded the floor. The judge adjusted his glasses and formally invited me to approach the podium to deliver my victim impact statement. I stood up from the front row of the gallery, adjusting my tailored suit, and walked methodically toward the center of the courtroom. I did not carry a piece of paper. I did not require notes to recall the precise sequence of her crimes. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium and addressed the presiding judge with absolute clinical detachment. I did not use a single ounce of emotional language. I did not speak about my broken heart or the profound betrayal of my family. I delivered cold, devastating facts. I stated that the defendant sitting before this court did not steal out of survival or sudden financial desperation. I explained that she executed a highly calculated, predatory financial takeover. I recounted the exact date and time of the anniversary dinner where she forcefully confiscated federal corporate expense cards under the false public pretense of managing my supposed dementia. I detailed how she deliberately targeted a retired man she believed was entirely helpless and legally defenseless. I shifted my gaze to Morgan, who immediately looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. I continued outlining the sheer scope of her unprecedented greed. I informed the court that within 48 hours of stealing those cards, she did not purchase groceries or pay utility bills. She executed a $65,000 wire transfer to bail out her father-failing commercial construction business. She brazenly bypassed federal security protocols by successfully impersonating my deceased wife on a recorded verification call. I stated that she then marched into a luxury dealership and forced a $90,000 transaction to purchase a custom matte black sports car, purely to elevate her superficial social status. I emphasized the most critical and unforgivable element of her crime. I reminded the judge that the capital she squandered did not belong to a private citizen. The stolen funds were explicitly allocated by the United States Treasury to provide emergency housing for disabled military veterans. The defendant did not just rob an elderly family member, she actively diverted critical resources away from vulnerable individuals who had served their country. She prioritized designer handbags and a luxury vehicle over the fundamental survival of homeless veterans. I concluded my statement by asserting that leniency would only validate her predatory behavior. I requested that the court impose the absolute maximum penalty allowed under federal sentencing guidelines, to ensure she could never financially exploit another human being or defraud the federal government ever again. I stepped away from the podium and returned to my seat, leaving the heavy, undeniable weight of my words echoing through the silent courtroom. The federal judge leaned back in his high leather chair and looked down at Morgan with an expression of profound judicial disgust. He adjusted his microphone and completely dismantled her pathetic theatrical display. He stated firmly that he had presided over hundreds of complex financial fraud cases during his tenure on the bench, but rarely had he witnessed such a staggering display of unrepentant arrogance. He explicitly told Morgan that her tears were entirely wasted on his courtroom. He cited the irrefutable digital evidence provided by the federal auditors. He pointed out that a stressed, overwhelmed housewife making a simple mistake does not expertly impersonate a dead woman to bypass a complex corporate security checkpoint. He noted that financial desperation does not result in the purchase of a $90,000 custom sports car or the booking of first-class international resort vacations. He systematically stripped away her entire victim narrative, exposing the cold, calculating predator lurking underneath. He declared that her actions required a high degree of malicious premeditation and a complete disregard for the ethical boundaries of society. He stated that her conscious decision to pillage a federal veteran housing grant to finance a fraudulent luxury lifestyle was one of the most morally bankrupt crimes he had ever encountered in his judicial career. Morgan, defense attorney, attempted to stand and offer a final mitigating plea, but the judge instantly raised his hand, silencing the lawyer completely. The time for negotiation and high-priced legal maneuvering had officially expired. The judge commanded Morgan to stand and face the court for her formal sentencing. She rose on trembling legs, clutching the edge of the defense table to keep from collapsing entirely. The judge read the final binding verdict with absolute unwavering authority. For the aggravated charges of interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and the explicit misappropriation of government treasury funds, he sentenced her to exactly 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He explicitly stated that due to the federal nature of the crime, there would be absolutely no possibility of early parole. Furthermore, he ordered complete and total financial restitution, demanding the immediate liquidation of her father's remaining commercial assets to repay the stolen veteran funds. The heavy wooden gavel dropped with a deafening absolute crack that sealed her fate forever. Morgan let out a guttural, horrifying shriek of pure panic. Her legs gave out completely and she collapsed toward the floor. 2 armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing her by the arms and hauling her roughly back to her feet. She thrashed and screamed wildly, crying out for her lawyer, crying out for a second chance as the marshals dragged her forcefully toward the side-holding door. I sat perfectly still in the gallery, watching the heavy steel door slam shut behind her, cutting off her frantic screaming and finalizing her total destruction. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut on Morgan. The sprawling colonial house in Whispering Pines is entirely mine again. The atmosphere inside these walls has completely transformed. There is no more pulsing electronic music shaking the floorboards, no more entitled shouting echoing down the grand staircase, and absolutely no more toxic anxiety lingering in the air. The sterile, generic, modern furniture Morgan purchased with my stolen funds was seized and auctioned off by the federal government to pay her restitution. I replaced it all with the warm, sturdy mahogany pieces Lorraine and I had collected over our decades of marriage. I moved my belongings out of the damp, cramped basement and reclaimed the master suite overlooking the front lawn. The house is meticulously clean, perfectly organized, and flawlessly peaceful. Every single morning I wake up to the sound of songbirds rather than the harsh, grating demands of two ungrateful parasites complaining about their manufactured struggles. The overwhelming silence of the property is not lonely or isolating in the slightest. It is a profound, healing tranquility. It is the undeniable, beautiful sound of absolute ownership and fully reclaimed dignity. I sat on the wide wraparound porch enjoying the crisp morning air and the warm sunlight filtering through the oak trees. A thick stack of official government files rested on the wrought iron table next to my cup of dark roast coffee. The federal veteran housing grants were now fully funded and operating with immaculate precision. With the stolen $65,000 successfully recovered from the liquidated remains of Apex Structural Solutions, the limited liability company was actively closing on 3 new properties. We were providing safe, permanent homes for disabled veterans who had actually earned their keep through genuine sacrifice and undeniable honor. The program was thriving, directly benefiting the men and women who truly needed the support. As I signed the final approval forms with my silver pen, my phone buzzed with a secure message from Alistair Pierce. He and I still kept in touch, occasionally sharing a drink downtown and trading updates on the remaining fallout of our operation. The message contained a brief, highly factual report on my former son. Cameron had not secured another prestigious architectural position. The intense public humiliation of the federal raid and his direct proximity to a major government embezzlement scandal had rendered him completely unemployable in the high-end corporate sector. Background checks immediately flagged his association with Morgan, making him a massive liability for any reputable design firm. He was currently working a grueling minimum wage job at a regional hardware store on the opposite side of the state. He lived in a cramped, drafty studio apartment located directly above a loud commercial laundromat, struggling daily to manage his basic utilities and grocery bills. There were no more luxury vehicles, no more tailored designer suits, and absolutely no safety nets to catch him when he inevitably stumbled. Alistair noted that Cameron had recently requested a small cash advance on his meager paycheck just to cover a standard dental bill. I read the detailed update and felt a profound, grounding sense of closure. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or a sudden emotional urge to send him an anonymous check. By cutting off his access to my wealth, I had forced him to face the brutal, uncompromising reality of the real world. For 38 years, I had completely insulated him from the harsh consequences of his own mediocrity. I had provided a comfortable, impenetrable shield that allowed his entitlement to fester and grow into a toxic weapon. Now he was finally learning how to survive using only his own 2 hands. He was learning the actual value of a hard-earned dollar, the heavy physical toll of manual labor, and the undeniable necessity of basic human humility. He was finally building the character I had tried to teach him when he was a boy, but he was doing it the hard way, entirely alone. The punishing reality of his new life was not an act of cruel vengeance. It was the absolute, unvarnished education he desperately needed to become a functioning adult. I deleted the message, locked my phone, and returned my full attention to the veteran files. My financial and emotional obligations to Cameron were permanently dissolved. My resources, my time, and my intellect were now strictly reserved for people who possessed genuine honor. I closed the final file folder, sealing the approval for a wheelchair-accessible home for a wounded Marine. The stark contrast between the deserving veterans I served and the greedy son I exiled could not be more clear. The federal machinery was doing its job, and I was doing mine, operating with a renewed sense of purpose that no parasitic relative could ever sabotage again. I leaned back in my wooden rocking chair, watching the morning sun illuminate the pristine, quiet neighborhood. I reflected deeply on the entire ordeal, analyzing the exact mechanics of what I call the silent adjustment. Society often conditions older generations to quietly endure the relentless disrespect of their adult children. We are expected to swallow our pride, tolerate the blatant financial exploitation, and accept the toxic mistreatment simply to maintain the fragile, polite illusion of a unified family. We are falsely told that unconditional love means providing endless financial bailouts and enduring constant emotional abuse without a single complaint. I completely and utterly reject that deeply flawed philosophy. Love without firm boundaries is not love at all. It is simply a hostage situation. By executing my plan, I did not merely protect a federal bank account or salvage my personal retirement fund. I saved my own soul. When you allow parasites to drain your resources, they do not just take your money. They systematically strip away your self-worth, your daily peace, and your fundamental right to exist without constant suffocating anxiety. Removing Morgan and Cameron from my life was an act of profound self-preservation. Cutting the cancer out required a sharp, ruthless precision, and it demanded an unwavering commitment to the absolute truth. The resulting health clarity and liberation were worth every single agonizing moment of the procedure. I no longer walked on eggshells in my own home. I no longer hid my assets or downplayed my intelligence to appease the fragile egos of inferior people. The silent adjustment had restored the natural order of my existence, proving that age does not diminish a man's capacity to protect his territory with absolute, devastating force. I lifted the porcelain cup to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the rich, dark coffee. The robust flavor grounded me in the absolute perfection of the present moment. I looked out over the sprawling green lawn where Morgan had once paraded in handcuffs and where Cameron had wept for a bailout he did not earn. The driveway was completely empty. The imposing commercial-grade steel deadbolts secured the heavy oak doors behind me, standing as impenetrable guardians of my newfound sanctuary. I am Lamar. I am a 70-year-old black man who built his entire life from the ground up, fighting through decades of adversity to secure a comfortable, unshakable future. I refuse to let my legacy be dismantled by the staggering greed of ungrateful people. I set the ultimate trap, executed it flawlessly, and walked away completely victorious. The silence surrounding me is not the quiet of defeat, abandonment, or isolation. It is the roaring, beautiful symphony of absolute freedom. It is the undeniable sound of a man who reclaimed his territory, protected his dignity, and secured his peace forever. I do not miss the chaos, and I certainly do not miss the people who caused it. My life is now a testament to the power of holding the line and refusing to be a victim. Let my story serve as a permanent, uncompromising warning to anyone who mistakes a quiet demeanor for weakness. We may be older, we may choose to observe in silence, and we may prefer a simple life, but we are absolutely never defenseless. The predators of the world will always eventually learn that the quietest men often possess the most devastating weapons. True power is never loud. It is the quiet, unwavering enforcement of your own boundaries. The greatest mistake you can make is financing the disrespect of those who view your generosity as a permanent weakness. When you stop funding their entitlement, their true character is immediately exposed. You cannot save people from the consequences of their own arrogance. Letting them fall is not cruelty. It is the ultimate act of accountability. Do not let family ties become a financial hostage situation. If this story resonated with you, share your own experiences with toxic relatives in the comments section right now.
Welcome to the Story Channel. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few notes. The content in this video uses AI-generated images and voice narration, combined with the channel's creative editing. Everything is intended solely for entertainment purposes and does not depict or reflect any real events or real people. Hope you enjoy the story and have a great time watching.